Committee on Foreign Affairs will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. To insert something to the record, please have your staff email the previously mentioned address or contact full committee staff. Please keep your video function on at all times, even when you're not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with House Resolution 965 and the accompanying regulations, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they're not under recognition to eliminate background noise. I see that we have a quorum, and I will now recognize myself for opening remarks. We meet today to discuss reporting that Russia put bounties on the heads of American and allied troops. Russian cash pouring into the Taliban's coffers in exchange for American lives. While we're going to steer clear of discussing any classified information in this hearing, I think I'm on safe ground to say that these allegations and claims were never denied by the White House. Russia's actions, if true, are unacceptable. The American people are demanding answers, and they're demanding accountability. This hearing is also a reminder that America's longest war, now approaching nearly 2 decades of continued conflict, still rages on in Afghanistan. Bringing the 9/11 terrorists to justice was an imperative, but few would argue today that U.S. national security interests are being served by this endless war. Just this past week, a young soldier from my hometown of San Antonio died in a vehicle rollover accident. Vincent Sebastian Ibarria. He was 21 years old and dreamed of becoming a nurse after serving in the Army. I express my condolences to his family and to the more than 2,000 American families who lost a loved one during this conflict. We need to bring this endless war to a close. Today, this committee looks to answer an important foreign policy question. Why has Russia faced no consequences, not even a public rebuke from the Trump administration? We invited Secretary Pompeo to testify today. He refused, which is what we've come to expect from this Secretary of State. While he makes plenty of time for interviews on Fox News and seems to relish bullying fact-based journalists from the State Department press room, he rarely, if ever, summons the courage to answer questions from his former colleagues in the House of Representatives, as every other Secretary of State before him has done. Russia is not our friend. Vladimir Putin is not a partner of the United States. He's a dictator who just last week extended his tenure to 2036. He's robbed his people of their rights. He's trampled on the sovereignty of his neighbors. He's used the resources of the Russian government to undermine democracy, splinter NATO and the EU, and bolster other despots like Assad. His tools are disinformation, violent suppression, and assassination. All of that is contemptible enough, but putting a price on American heads is a serious escalation. Exactly how the intelligence on this matter was presented to the president is still unclear. The Trump administration's excuses keep changing. Perhaps it was in his briefing, but that doesn't necessarily mean the briefers briefed him on it, because it's widely known that President Trump doesn't read the presidential daily briefing. Or maybe they didn't brief him because the intelligence was quote unquote disputed, even though only intelligence that is of major significance makes it into the presidential daily briefing. Per usual with President Trump, we're a long, long way from the buck stops here. Even if the administration's explanations are true, it paints a picture of incompetence at the highest levels of our national security apparatus. But what troubles me the most from a foreign policy perspective is what this White House did and did not do once it received this information. Was there a public condemnation of Russia and Vladimir Putin from the Trump administration? Did the State and Treasury Department slap sanctions on Russian officials involved in the plot? Did the Taliban, with whom we've been at war for nearly 2 decades, pay a price? What are the State and Defense Departments doing to protect our service members? And how are they working with our NATO allies who are contributing to the Resolute Support Mission in Afghanistan with us to address this threat? None of that. As a matter of fact, this president kept doing what he's been doing since even before he was elected. posing up to Vladimir Putin. Since the United States reportedly obtained this intelligence, President Trump has released a joint statement with Vladimir Putin, directed the purchase of faulty Russian ventilators, and withdrew from the Open Skies Treaty, a critical part of monitoring Russian military activity. He also ordered the reduction of Americans' troop presence in Germany, an act that was met with bipartisan rebuke and criticism from our allies, but with praise from the Russians. He even wanted to expand the G7 to include Russia again, which was expelled from the group in 2014 following Putin's illegal annexation of Crimea. It's almost as if President Trump is on a mission to make Russia great again. This issue is also not without precedent. In 2011, the Obama administration discovered that Pakistani intelligence officers urged Taliban-affiliated militants to attack the US Embassy and a NATO headquarters in Kabul. How did the Obama administration respond? Secretary Clinton and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mike Mullen, confronted Pakistani officials and publicly shamed them for these actions. Even though we were relying on Pakistan for certain access into Afghanistan, Admiral Mullen called the Haqqani network a veritable arm of Pakistani's intelligence agency. White House officials stood up for Americans and the troops who were in harm's way. The way this administration tries to distort reality and gaslight the American people is frankly a page right out of Vladimir Putin's playbook. But the facts are clear. The Trump administration failed in its most sacred duty to keep Americans safe. I hope that our witnesses can help us navigate all of this today and provide some ideas and insight about what our policy should look like under these circumstances. But before I turn to the witnesses, I want to recognize Ranking Member Mike Mccaul of Texas for his opening.
Can't hear anything. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hope everybody can hear me okay. Thank you for calling this important hearing. As I've said time and time again, and I agree with the chairman, that Vladimir Putin is not our friend, not a friend to the United States or our allies. In the past few years, we've witnessed his regime invade and occupy parts of Ukraine and Georgia, unleash devastating cyber attacks against our allies, use a banned nerve agent to try and kill a former Russian spy in the UK, prop up corrupt regimes in Syria and Venezuela. They meddled in our elections. They undermine American interests around the world. He has proven he just cannot be trusted, and he certainly is not our friend. And now we are faced with widely reported allegations that a Russian military intelligence unit, the GRU, has paid Taliban-linked militants to kill Americans and coalition forces in Afghanistan. While it's not news that Moscow has provided the Taliban with weapons and other support, and they've been there since 1979, Russia paying bounties for the murder of American service members would be an unacceptable escalation. If true, the administration, in my judgment, must take swift and serious action to hold the Putin regime accountable. And that should include not inviting Russia to rejoin the G7. We have passed, Mr. Chairman, as you know, sanctions that the administration can enact today on these Russian entities. Ultimately, there is nothing more important than protecting our American troops serving overseas. I think we can all agree we must take any threat to their safety very seriously, especially from someone with a track record like Putin. I hope we use our time today to discuss how to more effectively deal with the dangerous autocrat in the Kremlin, rather than descending into a partisan blame game. The only person who benefits from American infighting over this issue is Vladimir Putin. He loves chaos. And after last week's sham nationwide vote in Russia that allows Putin to remain in power through 2036, essentially making him the emperor of Russia, it's even more critical for Americans to work together with our allies, especially through NATO, to counter Putin's nefarious activities around the world. While the topic of this hearing will certainly center around Russia and Vladimir Putin, the backdrop is Afghanistan. I urge my colleagues to continue supporting our partners in Afghanistan to help bring peace and stability to their country. My friend, Ambassador Romani, has devoted herself to helping secure that future for Afghanistan. And I want to take this opportunity to thank her for her unwavering dedication to that mission. And I think it's very commendable that Afghanistan appoint a female ambassador to the United States. And I hope that she will be made a part of the negotiating team uh, when they meet with the Taliban. I would also like to note that I appreciate the White House quickly providing briefings on today's topic on both sides of the aisle, including myself, the chairman, and other members of the committee. And further, I know my colleagues want to get the full story, so I would encourage them to read all the classified materials provided on this important matter to get the entire picture. And so finally, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and our witnesses for their testimony. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member McCall. I'm now going to introduce the witnesses who will testify to us. Our first witness is Mr. Michael Morell, former acting director and deputy director of the Central Intelligence Agency. He's one of our nation's leading national security professionals and has been at the center of the nation's fight against terrorism, its work to prevent the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and efforts to counter U.S. adversaries like Russia and China. He also was previously in charge of organizing the President's Daily Brief under President George W. Bush. Our next witness is Dr. Celeste Wallander, former Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Russia/Central Asia on the National Security Council. She's a leading expert on Russian foreign policy, security, defense, and military affairs, and is the current President and CEO of the U.S.-Russia Foundation. Previously, Dr. Wallander also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia at the Department of Defense and was a professor at American University. After her will be our witness, General John Nicholson, a retired U.S. Army general and the former commander of the Afghan war effort, having led the 41-nation NATO-led Resolute Support Mission and the United States Forces Afghanistan for more than 2.5 years. His total U.S. Army career spanned over 36 years, with more than 12 of those years being spent at various NATO commands. He also serves as an adjunct faculty member on leadership with Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government and is a member of Harvard's Belfer Center, ELBA Group, which sustains Track 2 dialogue between retired American and Russian senior officials from military and intelligence background. And last but not least, we have Mr. Ian Brzezinski, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO and National Security Affairs staffer in the Senate. Mr. Brzezinski is a leading expert on Europe and NATO with more than 3 decades of experience and government service. He's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Brent Scowcroft Center on Strategy and Security and the Council's Future Europe initiative. Thank you all for being here. I will now recognize each witness for 5 minutes, and without objection, your prepared written statements will be made part of the record. Mr. Morell.
Chairman Castro, Ranking Member Mccaul, and members of this distinguished committee, good afternoon. It's an honor for me to be here with you today, and it's also an honor for me to testify alongside my distinguished panelists. Chairman, for the sake of time, I'm going to summarize the written testimony that I submitted to the committee. What I want to focus on is what I know, which is how the collection, dissemination, and analytic processes of the intelligence community work, how the PDB process works, how the policy process on something like this would have worked at senior levels of the Bush and the Obama administrations, in which I spent much time in the Situation Room. So with that in mind, I want to make 8 points. 1, there's a misperception about who receives raw intelligence. Many assume that it only goes to intelligence community analysts who decide what to share and in what context with intelligence consumers. That perception is not accurate. Raw intelligence gets disseminated widely to intelligence analysts, yes, but also to war fighters in the field and at the Pentagon, to policymakers at State Department and the Defense Department, as well as to senior White House officials via the White House Situation Room. The important point here is that many people would have already seen the raw intelligence as the analysts were just beginning their work on it. 2, a key question with regard to the raw intelligence is whether it was clear to a reader what might be happening, that is, what the Russians might be doing with these bounties, or if it was possible to only see that by connecting a number of dots. I don't know what the case was here. But even if it was only vaguely clear from the raw intelligence that the Russians might be paying bounties for the killing of American soldiers, that information would have made its way to the highest levels of the United States government, including the president, before the analysts concluded their work. 3, the lead IC agencies in assessing the information would have been the Central Intelligence Agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and the National Counterterrorism Center for reasons that I outline in my written testimony. The analysts would assess the information and they would come to 2 separate judgments. 1, whether or not they believed Moscow was offering the bounties, and if they believed that, number 2, their level of confidence in that judgment, low, medium, or high. 4, if the analysts believed at any level of confidence that the Russians were providing the bounties, that judgment would be presented in the PDB. If the president does not read the PDB, and not all presidents have, then it would have been briefed to him. If not by the president's briefer, then by the Director of National Intelligence or the Director of CIA, or even those senior administration officials who were aware of it, such as the National Security Advisor, the White House Chief of Staff, or the Vice President. 5, contrary to what has been said by some, a dissent within the intelligence community on either the judgment itself or on the confidence level would not keep the piece out of the PDB. Rather, the dissent would be noted in the PDB piece. 6, once the piece was in the PDB, the IC leadership on something of this significance would brief Congress as early as the same day as the piece ran in the PDB, and certainly no later than the next day. 7, if the intelligence community assessed that the Russians were providing the bounties at any level of confidence, that would kick off a policy process inside the NSC staff on how the US should respond. The analyst's level of confidence would make a difference to that process. A medium to high level of confidence would lead to a policy decision, I believe, on how to respond, while a low level of confidence would result in a decision that more intelligence was necessary before a policy decision could be made. I will leave it to General Nicholson to explain how the warfighters in Afghanistan would have reacted to the information and to the analysis at any level of confidence. 8, and finally, a medium to high level confidence judgment that the Russians were offering the bounties would, in every administration that I worked in, and I worked in 6, have resulted in some sort of policy action designed to deter the Russians going forward. The safety of our troops would have required it. Mr. Chairman, let me stop there, and I look forward to answering the committee's questions.
Thank you, Mr. Morell. I'll now go to Dr. Wallander.
Thank you. I thank the committee members for the invitation to contribute to your work. Today, I will summarize my written testimony. And for the purposes of today's discussion, I will assume that the publicly reported details of the intelligence assessment are accurate. These operations are embedded in a nearly decade-long Russian campaign of strategic competition that aims to weaken the United States and advance Russian power and influence. The Russian leadership recognizes that while it is a peer to the United States in strategic nuclear capabilities, it does not match the United States in global power projection and in conventional military capabilities. Russia seeks to compete where it has advantages in the asymmetric terrain and to avoid competition that could lead to its failure. Russia has invested in tools and methods to asymmetrically counter American advantages, whether those lie in extremist lies in social media, limited military interventions in Ukraine and Syria, cyber intrusions in networks and infrastructure abroad, or interfering in American and European politics. Russia also deploys asymmetric tools to deny responsibility, however implausible that deniability has proven, in order to be able to operate with impunity and exploit ambiguities. This takes place in the phase 0 end of the conflict spectrum, the sub-military conflict strategic environment in which diplomatic, informational, political, and economic conditions shape a country's capacity to secure its interests short of active military confrontation. The concept is not unique to Russian security doctrine, but its centrality and asymmetric nature is distinctive in Russian doctrine and operations. Russian asymmetric phase 0 operations are conducted not only by political, but also Russian military actors, primarily Russian military intelligence, the GRU, and quasi-private actors such as the Wagner Group. The earliest stages of operations in Ukraine in March of 2014, political protests, were managed by GRU agents. The Russian operation to influence the US 2016 presidential election was a classic phase 0 shaping operation, a mix of friendly foreign, WikiLeaks, quasi-private Internet Research Agency, non-military, the FSB, and Russian military actors. The asymmetric phase 0 framework helps to explain why the GRU has surfaced in a number of operations in Europe, the US, and now in Afghanistan. Across all of these cases, GRU operations are ambitious and sloppy. It is unlikely that President Putin personally approves every GRU operation, yet the GRU continues to operate despite being exposed. This means that there is no question that it operates with political cover and approval at the highest levels of the Russian leadership, which is therefore responsible for these operations. Why would the Russian leadership allow the GRU to play such a dangerous game? Because Russia has for years successfully managed asymmetric operations to keep the competition in spheres where it has operational advantages. It has exploited implausible deniability to operate in the asymmetric phase 0 spectrum with impunity. Russia is succeeding. In this specific case, it may be that Russia assessed that the Taliban was insufficiently active in striking coalition forces and needed incentives in order to hasten US failure and withdrawal. It might be that Russia sought to complicate the US-Taliban relationship. Whatever the strange reasoning may have been, this crosses a threshold. Russia is seeking to exploit implausibly deniable asymmetric operations now directly against US military forces. The Russian government has gotten away with its phase 0 operations because we are not well equipped to compete in the asymmetric space, because we tend to view these operations as political, not security competition, and because we have all allowed the implausibly deniable to be denied and explained away. The result has been a creeping escalation and exploitation of asymmetric operations that thwart effective US response. Caution is warranted. The other end of the conflict spectrum is mutually assured destruction, but caution does not require paralysis. The United States should build defenses against these operations, it should disrupt these operations, and it should directly hold the Russian leadership accountable at the military, political, and top level of leadership. If we do not defend ourselves, if we do not disrupt these Russian operations, and we do not hold the Russian leadership accountable, they will continue, and they may continue to escalate. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Wallander. We'll next go to General Nicholson. General?
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member, for the honor to appear before this committee. And it's also a pleasure to be alongside such distinguished colleagues. I'll summarize some of the major points from my written submission. History tells us that miscalculations and mistakes are what leads to war. And of course, they're especially dangerous with respect to the United States and Russia because of our substantial nuclear arsenals. And if indeed they did this, this would be a serious miscalculation and a serious mistake. As we know, there were periods of shared interest and some cooperation in Afghanistan. Up through 2012, logistical cooperation through the Northern Distribution Network was a positive aspect of our relationship with Russia. But after 2014, that changed. With the annexation of Crimea, the invasion of Ukraine, the threats to the eastern states of the NATO alliance, within NATO, where I was the Allied Land Commander at the time, we began drawing up defensive plans for the first time in the 25 years since the end of the Cold War. When I moved from Turkey to Afghanistan in 2016, by that time, the Russians had intervened in Syria. And of course, we saw a major focus by the United States on ISIS and Syria. But at that time also, we saw a modest increase in capabilities by the Russians in Central Asia. And of course, we discussed this up our chain of command and through intelligence and military channels. Myself, General Votel, General Scaparrotti, Secretary Mattis all addressed this publicly. And let me go a little bit into that because it ties into what the other witnesses have referred to. What we saw was a pattern that they had used in Crimea, Ukraine, the Baltics, and Syria of using military exercises as a way to move capabilities and people into an area and then leave some behind. This would desensitize us to their presence. It would generate options for them, and obviously would reduce our warning times should they choose to use these capabilities. This slow, gradual buildup, while we were focused primarily on Syria, was of concern enough to me as commander that we highlighted this and eventually called them out. At the same time, they were arming and equipping and giving money to the Taliban. Now, it was in modest quantities. It was not designed to be a game changer on the battlefield. For example, the Taliban wanted surface-to-air missiles. The Russians didn't give them to them. So I always concluded that their support to the Taliban was calibrated in some sense. But just because it was calibrated doesn't mean that it wasn't important and it didn't cause us difficulties. In the northern part of Afghanistan in particular, in Kunduz, this Russian assistance did help the Taliban to inflict higher casualties on the Afghan security forces and more hardship on the Afghan people. Despite all of this, I was somewhat surprised to read the reports of Russian involvement in bounties because this is so risky and irresponsible that it would mark a departure from this previously calibrated approach. And of course, the layers of complexity inside the Russian decision-making process and inside Afghanistan are baffling even to those who know these areas deeply. But if this is validated, regardless of who made this decision, whether it was made in Moscow or made in the field, regardless of whether Russian leaders were complicit directly or whether they were merely incompetent in their failure to control operations, they are still responsible. It's also important to note that there were two sides to this transaction. The Russians offered and the Taliban accepted. And this is in direct contradiction to the spirit and the letter of the Afghan peace agreement. So if we assess that Russia put bounties on Americans and coalition members, then what should we do about it? Number one, we need to condemn this action from the highest levels of the United States government and NATO so the Russians understand it's unacceptable. Two, with respect to Russia, we should suspend any troop withdrawals from Germany. These troop withdrawals play into Russian desires to undermine and weaken NATO. If carried out despite these bounties, this will be viewed as a sign of American weakness in the face of Russian threats. Three, with respect to the Taliban, we should hold on our troop drawdown in Afghanistan at the present level until the Taliban have met the conditions that they agreed to in the peace agreement. We have delivered on our part by drawing down to 8,600 ahead of schedule. The Taliban need to deliver on theirs. And this includes severing ties with al-Qaeda, the inter-Afghan peace negotiations, and a sustained reduction in violence. Our long war in Afghanistan is only going to end at the peace table. And as leaders, we all have a moral responsibility to do everything in our power to protect our service members who are fighting for an enduring peace in Afghanistan and to deliver on the sacrifice of the Americans, the coalition members, and the Afghans who came before them. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General. Mr. Brzezinski. I think you may be on mute. There you go.
Mr. Chairman, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you. Chairman Castro, Ranking Member Mccaul, distinguished members of the committee. Americans are rightly outraged by reports of Russia placing bounties on U.S. military personnel in Afghanistan. These reports, as heinous as they are, underscore a broader challenge confronting the West: Russia's pattern of escalating, aggressive international conduct. Over the last decade and a half, Moscow has applied the full suite of Russian power to dominate its neighbors, create division in the West, and position Russia as a global power. The suite of tools has included military and paramilitary forces, economic and energy embargoes, assassination and political subterfuge, information and cyber warfare, separatist groups, and frozen conflicts. That campaign history includes the 2007 cyber attack on Estonia, the 2008 invasion of Georgia, the 2014 invasion of Ukraine, the 2016 coup attempt in Montenegro, assassinations in the United Kingdom, Germany, just last week in Austria, and elsewhere. As the committee has documented, Russia has meddled not only in the elections of our allies, but even in our own elections. This willingness to directly attack the United States took a kinetic dimension in Syria in 2018. There, Russian paramilitary units attacked outposts known to be manned by U.S. Special Operations Forces. In light of all this, recent reports of Russia's bounties on American soldiers are disturbingly consistent with what has been a steady escalation of Russian international interference and aggression. Now, over the past decade and a half of this, the West's response, including the United States, to Russia's assertiveness has consisted of limited incremental escalations of economic sanctions and military deployments, complemented by half-hearted and short-lived diplomatic isolation. This incrementalism conveys hesitancy and a lack of unity and determination on behalf of the United States and the Western alliance. It has failed to convince Putin to reverse course, and it may have actually emboldened him. Continued incrementalism not only promises continued confrontation with Russia, it increases the risk of conflict, both intentional and unintentional. U.S. strategy regarding Putin's Russia needs to be calibrated to this reality. Properly calibrated engagement entails exploring avenues through which to modulate tension and foster collaboration. But it also requires more immediate and stronger measures to deter and counter Russian aggression and provocation. Toward those ends, U.S. strategy should include the following priorities. First, we need to increase NATO's readiness for a high-intensity conflict. Russia's military modernization efforts and its concentration of forces on its eastern frontier have increased the risk of conflict in Europe. This reality, of course, underscores the need for our NATO allies to continue increasing their military capability and readiness. But there's more the U.S. can and should do. We should transition the U.S. Armored Brigade combat team in Poland and related elements to a permanent presence. The U.S. should also permanently station in the Baltics a special forces contingent. President Trump should reconsider his decision to withdraw U.S. forces from Germany. Removing forces from Europe weakens our deterrent posture in Europe just when the threat in Russia is elevating. It signals a lack of commitment to European security that President Putin will surely relish. Second, we need to more robustly support the transatlantic aspirations of Georgia and Ukraine. NATO enlargement expanded the zone of peace and security in Europe and strengthened the alliance's military capability. Both Ukraine and Georgia should be provided a clear path to NATO membership. Perpetuating the position in a zone of geopolitical ambiguity only animates Putin's appetite and sense of opportunity to reassert dominion over these two democracies. Third, we need to more effectively counter Russia's dissemination of false information. In this realm, the United States essentially disarmed itself when it closed the doors in 1999 of the United States Information Agency. This multi-billion-dollar agency was our frontline force on the information front. Congress should reestablish or establish a modernized version of USIA so that the United States can return to the offense in this dynamic and fast-paced dimension of international affairs. Fourth, we should increase economic sanctions on Russia. Today's sanctions may impair the Russian economy, but if their intended outcome has been to deter Russian aggression, they have failed by that measure. Sanctions should be escalated from measures primarily aimed against specific Russian individuals and firms to a more comprehensive sectoral sanctions against Russian financial and energy sectors. Finally, we need to strengthen Western cohesion and unity. These aforementioned actions will only be fully effective if they are complemented by unity in purpose and action within the transatlantic community. So, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Mccaul, as you and the committee address the intelligence regarding Russian bounties, I urge you to also assess the effectiveness of U.S. policy in terms of deterring, countering, and containing the full spectrum of Moscow's malign ambitions and actions. When it comes to Russia, the time is long overdue for an unequivocal U.S. policy. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Brzezinski, and thank you to all the witnesses for your testimonies. I'll now recognize members for 5 minutes, 5 minutes each. And pursuant to House rules, all time yielded is for the purposes of questioning our witnesses. Because of the virtual format of this hearing, I will recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between Democrats and Republicans. If you miss your turn, please let our staff know and we'll come back to you. If you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphone and address the chair verbally. And as we start questioning, I'll start by recognizing myself. I want to ask a question of Mr. Morell first. In instances where the Russians paid to have American service members killed, and it appears from press accounts, at least some press accounts, that the Russian plot did result in American deaths. In your experience, as somebody who carried out the presidential daily briefing, is this something that intelligence briefers would make the president aware of?
Yes, sir, without a doubt.
Is there anyone on the panel, based on your own expertise, who believes that the president would not have been made aware of this information? Anyone? No one? Thank you. If the president advisors, in the event that the president's advisors really withheld such alarming intelligence from him, even as he made continuous concessions to Russia, who would ultimately be responsible for such process failures, mid-level career civil servants or administration leadership? And I ask that of anyone on the panel. If, for example, the intelligence was somehow not provided to him, then where does the failure lie?
Congressman, maybe I can jump in here, having been in the Oval Office every morning with President Bush for a year and then many times with President Obama. If the president's briefer did not raise something of such importance, then I believe it falls on whoever else is there from the intelligence community, the DNI or the director of CIA. And barring their failure to raise such information, I think it falls on the responsibility of the National Security Advisor to make absolutely certain the president knows.
Okay.
Could I add to Mike's point, which is that every morning in the Obama White House, among the duties of the senior directors was to read the PDBs in advance of the presentation of the PDB to the president by the briefers, and to provide for the National Security Advisor, in our case Susan Rice, advice and context, because she would go in and be part of that briefing and be ready to make sure that, as Mike pointed out, the briefing had been received and correctly understood by the White House leadership.
Okay. And we have about 2 minutes left on my questioning, and some of you in your remarks, your testimony, suggested different courses of action, different responses that the United States could take. I want to ask you this question. So far, as I mentioned in my remarks, there's been not even a public condemnation by the president or the White House against Russia for these reported actions. Let me ask you this, and we only have about 1 minute and 45 seconds. What is the cost of the United States not even saying a word to Russia about these reported actions?
Congressman, let me jump in here again. I did not make any recommendations about what steps the U.S. should take, but I think it's really important that we all recognize something about Vladimir Putin's personality. He is a risk taker. And when he takes a risk and he succeeds, in his mind, he is often willing to take even larger risks in the future. So the failure for him to face any cost here, I think significantly increases the chances of him doing something else to undermine the United States, possibly even larger than what we've seen in this case.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Mr. Brzezinski.
if I could compliment Director Morell's point on the other side. When we do push back on Putin and push back firmly, he does respond. He's ultimately a pragmatist. And as Dr. Wallander pointed out, he picks his battles carefully. And I look back to the case of the invasion of Georgia. The turning point of that invasion was actually when the United States demonstrated some military muscle. We flew back a military cargo plane right in the middle of that conflict, demonstrating that we were willing to take sacrifices and risks, basically putting right on the face in front of Putin the risk of a direct military confrontation with the United States. And that was basically the turning point of that invasion. So if we are more forceful, if we are more firm, we do have very good prospects of actually restraining Putin's actions and ambitions.
Thank you, Mr. Brzezinski. And I'm going to keep myself on time on the questioning, so I'll go over to Ranking Member Mike Mccaul.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just, without commenting on the specifics of the intelligence, there was a very strong dissent. The briefer was a career intelligence officer that made this decision not to brief. And I guess the question is whether it's actionable intelligence. Having said that, I think the nature of this intelligence being targeted at U.S. troops would be a significant departure for Russia in its dealings with the Taliban. And I personally think that the president deserved to at least know about this. I think if true, and I know that the intelligence community is going back and doing a deep dive, I do think Russia should be condemned and the GRUs should be sanctioned as we have authorized by Congress. My first question is to General Nicholson. You've been in Afghanistan for quite some time, and we say all the panelists are very, very impressive with your testimony. I think this calls into question the good faith of the Taliban. I do think, though, since a peace plan has been entered into, there have been no Americans targeted, although they are targeting Afghan, nationals. Can you tell me, number one, how significant a departure this would be? Because we know they are arming and giving cash to the Taliban to kill ISIS, but this would be a different policy change to target American troops. And secondly, does it call into question the good faith negotiating of the Taliban?
Thank you, Ranking Member Mccaul. I do think it calls into question the good faith of the Taliban. There's two parts to this transaction, again, if validated. But we do know that the Russians have provided small arms, ammunition, money to the Taliban and have been doing it for some time. And frankly, the ability to direct that and control it and where it's used and where it's not used is extremely limited. Once it's turned over to them, they'll use it as they see fit. And I have no doubt that some of that was used in the northern part of Afghanistan against Afghan units with American advisors, especially in the Kunduz area. And so I think that in this sense, now specifically offering bounties is a small step from what they were already doing. Their justification for this action was the fight against ISIS. But part of this was, as the other witnesses have mentioned, a false narrative and misinformation on the part of Russia that the United States was supporting ISIS. So I think that this does call into question the Taliban's commitment to the agreement. As I mentioned in my statement, they need to sever ties with al-Qaeda. There should be a sustained reduction in violence, and they need to begin the peace talks that they are committed to do.
If I could get to that with my limited time, I met with the Ambassador Rahmani, Afghanistan's our special envoy. They're having discussions this week about a humanitarian ceasefire. My concern is all the good work that you've done over there. If the Taliban overruns Afghanistan and takes over, then we have a safe haven for many years to come. Right. How do you view that peace plan moving forward? And what kind of, I always believe whether it's Syria, Iraq, we need a residual force, if anything, to protect the homeland. What are your thoughts on force reduction?
I think that this level of 8,600, we should hold there until the Taliban deliver on their portion of the peace agreement and we move to the next stage. So I do think that's important. I do think there is a threat from the region in terms of the multitude of terrorist groups that are over there. We have over 20 designated groups, U.S. designated groups in the region. And I think that with the government in Afghanistan, we should consider, if they ask us to stay and request our help to keep pressure on these groups, it's definitely something we should consider.
I can tell you from the Afghan ambassador they do. Let me ask real quickly, Brzezinski, Secretary. The president's decision in Germany, I sent a letter with Adam Kinzinger saying this sends a bad message to NATO forces, to Putin, CENTCOM, AFRICOM. However, if they move some of these forces, as they talked about, the National Security Advisor, to Poland and the Baltic nations, describe to me how that would work, and would that be even a better strategy?
It would be better than pulling the forces back from Germany to the United States. But I don't think we ought to be punishing Germany to the benefit of Poland. We need a robust presence in Poland, and we have one now, which is, I think, of an appropriate level. I would make it more permanent. But that's a frontline presence. You want your rear guard, your rear echelons to also be robust. We need a robust presence in Germany. So not only we can reinforce the Baltics, we can also reinforce Southern Europe. And then, of course, we need a robust presence in Germany if we want to have a robust military relationship with the Germans and other militaries of the NATO alliance. So this decision by the president is undercutting not only our relationship with Germany, it's undercutting our operational efficiency to reinforce our frontline forces in Poland and frontline operations in the Baltics. So this is a potential, if it gets executed, a real setback, a weakening of our deterrent posture in Europe.
Well, I talked to the ambassadors in the Baltic states and Poland, and they would obviously very much welcome our presence there. And I know, Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. You've been very generous. I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony.
Thank you, Ranking Member Mccaul. We'll go to Congressman Brad Sherman.
Thank you. I want to thank our witnesses for coming before us, but the loudest testimony is being given by the witness who didn't show up. Secretary Pompeo was invited and strongly urged to come before us, and his refusal to do so shouts loudly that the process for decision-making on foreign policy and the outcome of the decision-making in this White House is indefensible. We have a situation where Russia attacks Georgia, the Ukraine, interferes in Syria, interferes in elections in the United States, interferes in Montenegro, occupies eastern Ukraine, and the Crimea, and according to Secretary Pompeo, when he speaks, but of course not to our committee, has been arming the Taliban for years. So we have all those facts, plus good reason to believe that they are providing bounty on our soldiers. And the response from the White House is, let's invite them to the G8. There's been another response that recently a Department of Treasury decision, basically, and I'll get to this later, they should have prevented Americans from buying Russian sovereign debt, and they went as light on that as they possibly could under the law. General Nicholson, in March 2018, you've said that you've had weapons brought into your headquarters that you know were given to the Taliban by the Russians. As recently as last week, Russia claims it only supplies weapons to the, quote, legitimate government of Afghanistan. For how long and in what quantity have or what estimated quantity have the Russians provided weapons to the Taliban?
Thank you for the question, sir. We believe it was a modest amount of support. It was designed to gain influence with the Taliban. And to be fair, our intentions were uncertain at that point. When would the U.S. withdraw? When would NATO withdraw? What would be left behind? There would be instability in the region. So we saw this as an attempt by the Russians to gain influence with the Taliban as part of potentially a post-withdrawal scenario. However, that should not be misconstrued. These weapons made a difference on the battlefield. They weren't game changing in a sense, but they did make a difference, and they did help inflict higher casualties and against units that had U.S. advisors.
So we know that Americans have died as a result of Russia providing those weapons. They've just now apparently added the additional obscenity of not just giving the weapons to people who want to kill us, but giving them extra money if they actually do. I'd like to focus on Russian sovereign debt and other targeted sanctions. Under existing statute, the Secretary of the Treasury was supposed to choose from a menu of sanctions for other Russian wrongdoing dealing with their sovereign debt. If we completely shut off American involvement in their sovereign debt, we could probably drive up their borrowing costs by 0.5 percentage point. But the Secretary of the Treasury, in the midst of all this, decided to say, well, it's fine for Americans to buy this debt in the secondary market and to buy the debt directly from state-owned enterprises. Would a ban on any American involvement in Russian sovereign debt be the kind of pain that Putin would feel? And what other economic sanctions do you think are appropriate? I'll ask whichever witness wants to respond.
I can take that one, sir. One of the most important targets to impose costs on political decision makers in Russia is indeed the financial sector in general, and sovereign debt is certainly part of a menu where you could increase those costs. I think that as an instrument of overall U.S. policy or U.S. policy up to this instance, that is constructive and smart. I would say in this instance, though, I would target sanctions in two areas. One, more on the security services, on defense sales, on the kinds of money that Russia makes from sales of defense capabilities abroad, and on financing that supports many of these asymmetric operations, that would target it more directly on those who are responsible for these decisions.
If I can interrupt you, obviously we'd like to prevent Russia from selling weapons to India, Turkey, and others, but that's not something we have the sovereign right to do. And as long as the Russian government can borrow money, the fact that particular military complexes cannot borrow the money is fairly irrelevant, and that the money is fungible. Once you lend it to the Russian sovereign, they can certainly lend it or invest it in military operations. I'll point out that we had an amendment in last year's NDAA, which I wrote to prohibit U.S. purchase of sovereign debt of Russia and its enterprises until they could go a full election cycle without interfering in our elections. That bill that passed the House, but of course was stripped out by the Senate. I'm hoping that senators realize that now is the time to impose some real sanctions on Russia for all of its behaviors, and
Okay.
with this bounty. And I yield back.
Thank you. All right, Mr. Shabbat of Ohio.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. First of all, there ought to be no question in anybody's mind that Russia and Putin in particular, no friend of the, and anybody who thinks otherwise is on the wrong path and doesn't know what they're thinking about or talking about or anything else. They are not our friend. General Nicholson, let me go to you with the first question. The reason we went to Afghanistan in the first place was to root out terrorists there and to ensure that they could never use that country to stage attacks against the United States again. Could you give us your current assessment of the strength of the Taliban, Al-Qaeda ties, the relationship currently? And is there any reason to believe that the Taliban would ever or will ever live up to any commitments that they might make?
Thank you for the question, sir. And I have to caveat this by saying I don't have access to the classified intelligence that I did when I was commander in the time since I've left. However, you've hit the nail on the head. This is why we went there. The idea that it would never be used as a launching pad for attacks against the U.S., that has not happened. So we have been successful in that sense. But I am concerned that they have not renounced their ties to al-Qaeda. This is one of the conditions in the agreement. And not only a public renunciation, but a real severing of ties with al-Qaeda. And this was the original reason that brought us there. And of course, this condition has to be met to have an enduring peace that secures our interests.
Thank you very much. Mr. Brzezinski, I'll go to you next if I can. What does Russia hope to achieve in Afghanistan, especially with respect to us? It would seem that if they want us to leave, they should be working to stabilize the country and decrease, not increase, U.S. deaths. Could you talk about Russia's goals, their security interests in Afghanistan currently?
Thank you, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes, hear you fine.
Great. I think Russian objectives in Afghanistan are the following. One, there's a bit of a revenge element because particularly when it comes to the team that hangs and includes President Putin in Moscow, they're bitter over the Soviet loss in that country that they see was catalyzed by U.S. support to the Mujahideen at that time. A second, I think they want to impose pain to help tie us down, to impose cost, to psychologically break our mental fortitude as an international actor. And then three, ultimately, they would like to see us leave and leave in a way that enables them to develop a relationship with whatever would succeed in Afghanistan, so they can establish a relationship to further their influence in that in that region. So three things: revenge, imposing pain, and tying us down, and then ultimately getting us out so that they can enhance their influence over the region.
Thank you. Mr. Brzezinski, I'll stick with you if I can. It seems like we've been playing defense vis-a-vis the Russians and the Chinese, for that matter, relative to disinformation and propaganda for way too long, for some time. What would you suggest in terms of a more proactive U.S. policy in this area? And of course, we're not interested in propaganda. We're interested in getting the truth out there. But how can the U.S. do a better job vis-a-vis both Russia and the Chinese in that sphere?
Information operations have been a long part of U.S. policy. It was our effective management of information operations, engagement, so to speak, public diplomacy in the Cold War that was part of one of the key elements of why we won. We won economically, we won militarily, but we also won in the information and engagement sphere, the public diplomacy sphere. The cornerstone, the driver of that dimension of our strategy was the United States Information Agency, an agency that we shut down in 1999 at a time when it had roughly $2 to $3 billion budget, and at the high point, USIA I think had over 10,000 people working to get the U.S. perspective out, working to deepen ties, working to support dissidents around the world. When we shut down USIA in 1999, we basically disarmed ourselves in the information space, and we've never really kind of been able to recover from that. So that's why I believe we ought to reanimate this institution, give it cabinet level rank, bring back its bureaucracy, to use that terrible word, and enable us to get back in the game of information operations on the offensive. That's going to be critical because right now we've handicapped ourselves.
Thank you. My time's expired, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Shabbat. Gregory Meeks of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Former Secretary of State George Shultz, I'm told, would ask outgoing ambassadors, and he'd take them aside and point to the map and ask them, "Where's your country?" And naturally, these outgoing ambassadors would point to their new host countries. And here Secretary Shultz would correct them and tell them their country is the United States of America. So I'm often confounded by the president's actions that directly undermine the interests and security of the American people. This latest intelligence revelation is an alarming pattern by this president. The fact that the Secretary of State, Pompeo, is not testifying today is yet another alarming pattern of this administration. Congress has an oversight responsibility and duty, and the Secretary of State should be here to answer our questions. And I'm glad that our esteemed witnesses are here today. But it's unfathomable to me that the Russian government continues to be unchecked as it engages in a systemic and aggressive policy to undermine, dismantle, and disrupt American alliances, threaten our democracy, and allegedly go after our troops. Time and time again, this committee asks, where is the president's loyalty and why does he fail to act? It is outrageous to me that we ask our servicemen and women to put their lives in danger for our peace and security, and yet the administration won't believe a credible piece of intelligence putting bounties on their head. How was Congress never briefed until the claims were linked to the press at great risk to whistleblowers? This failure to act, this unwillingness to brief this committee and others reflects a continued antagonism and disdain for this body as a co-equal branch of government. The Russian government continues to operate adversarially, and the president continues to show deference to Putin. By the administration's actions and inactions, it's unclear to me how President Trump would answer Secretary Shultz's question today, where is your country? Let me ask, and I think that I want to ask General Nicholson. Mr. Morell referenced that war fighters often also have access to raw intelligence. Can you describe in your experience how you and war fighters at the tactical level would have handled and acted upon raw intelligence that suggested Russia had put bounties on American troops?
Thank you, sir. Yes, we do have access to that intelligence, and there's a vigorous dialogue that goes on at all levels between commanders, intel officers, the different agencies. Multiple times, if I had a question, I would call back to Washington, talk to the heads of the various agencies, and we would compare our perceptions and fill in the blanks. And so this dialogue, very active, is extremely important, and it helped inform me as a commander in the field so that I could make the best decisions to accomplish the mission and protect my troops. So, for example, if there were a threat out there that was identified, even if it was raw intelligence, then you would see commanders in the field, war fighters, take immediate steps to protect their service members, regardless of kind of the validation. You would typically, the default would be to act on that intelligence, especially with protective measures. Now, before you might go offensively, you would want more precise, actionable intelligence. The other thing we would do is immediately elevate it and let people know. So in the case of the Russian arming and funding that went to the Taliban in 2018, one of the ways that we acted on this was to go public. And I did an interview with a British broadcasting company in which we talked about what the Russians were doing. The fact that governors of northern provinces had brought me weapons and said these came from Russia, were given by the Russians to the Taliban. This getting it into the public domain elicits a response. It may just be a denial, but you've got it on their radar screen. They know they're being watched, and they know you're pushing back. And so these kinds of actions are extremely important. And of course, the higher up you go, the more powerful the response is. And so this is why in my opening comments, I said pushing back on this kind of behavior at the highest levels is extremely important. And so thank you for holding this hearing, because this is one of the ways we make the Russians aware that we're watching.
I couldn't agree with you more. He only got a few seconds. I wish at the highest level, our president of the United States would push back on this Russian aggression, and particularly in regards to the bounties that may have been put on the heads of our men and women in the service. And I see I'm out of time, so I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Meeks. We'll go to Mr. Perry of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the witnesses. I'll start out with Mr. Morell. Mr. Morell, have you seen the intelligence regarding the bounty story?
No, sir.
Okay. How about Mr. Nicholson? Have you seen the intelligence?
No, sir, I have not.
Okay, thank you. How about Dr. Wallander? Have you seen the intelligence regarding the statements?
No, sir, I have not.
Dr. Wallander, in particular, as I read here from your notes, that you have assumed that the published stories are true. Is that, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that's what my notes show me. Is that correct or incorrect?
I said that for the purposes of this hearing, to be able to address and explain what Russia is up to in general, that I would assume that they were true. I wouldn't address the falsity or truth of the public reports.
I mean, that's a pretty, I mean, I understand for the purposes of the hearing, but you understand there's a bigger story here, and just making the presumption or assumption that they're true, A, not having seen any of the intelligence personally, and B, understanding that the GRU is, as I'm sure you all know, is daily engaged in misinformation. And finally, that, as you probably know, this is based on very specious reports of human intelligence by individuals that have a motive to provide misinformation to the United States. I just think that that's breathtakingly irresponsible. But that having been said, do you think it's appropriate, based on this conjecture, based on just reports from the New York Times that are based on yet even more specious human intelligence by people that aren't very friendly to the United States of America, that this president take action against a strategic adversary? Do any of you think that that would be appropriate?
Thank you, sir, for your question. And I would, to answer it, I would say that if this were reported in a PDB, that it is certainly appropriate for the leadership of the United States government to decide on a messaging strategy, which is short of what you asked about, a broader action strategy. Certainly a messaging strategy. I would personally start with the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff speaking to their counterparts, because this, if the reports are true, the GRU reports to the Russian Minister of Defense. So I hope that, addresses it. I think that would be the first step. You're absolutely right. Actual action wouldn't be warranted based on this sort of report.
Right. I mean, where in your mind, and ladies and gentlemen, your mind, the three that I've asked the questions of, where does verification of the intelligence lie in relation to the timeline of when you either take actions or make statements? Where does verification of intelligence lie? Does this, as soon as you hear the report, the rumor, the supposition, the claim, is action required then, or does verification fall anywhere inside in between the time you hear it and the time you take action or make statements?
So, Congressman, maybe I can answer that question. I think that an administration is required to take action. Whatever that action is obviously part of the policy process, but is required to take action when the intelligence community judges with medium to high confidence that something has happened. And that's why, for me, knowing what that level of confidence is on this judgment is so very important, because I think if it is low.
Are you saying, Mr. Morell, are you saying that you have information that you can verify or justify that we had medium to high confidence that this story is true?
No, sir. The point I'm trying to make is I don't know what the level of confidence was, but if it was low, then I would be perfectly comfortable with senior policymakers going back to the intelligence community and saying, we need more information. We need to take a harder look at this. You've got to collect more and figure out whether this is right or not.
Well, I would agree with you. I would agree with you, Mr. Morell. And before the president or anyone takes action, I think it's important to verify that. I'm just going to quote the chairman of the committee on the death of Soleimani. where he said the decision to kill Soleimani escalated tensions with Iran and risked plunging us into war. And I remind everybody on the panel that Soleimani is a target that we had complete and verified intelligence on for many, many years of the deaths of thousands of American service members and maiming of thousands of others of my friends who served in uniform. And the criticism was robust for the president regarding that decision, where there was verified, actionable intelligence over a long period of time, and there is none. There is none with this. With that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, may I just add one point?
Sure, please.
So I don't want to leave anyone with the impression that I know that the confidence level was low, or the confidence level was medium, or the confidence level was high. So I think that's just very important. If it was medium to high, then I think that required action on the part of the president.
Thank you. We will now go to Albiocides of New Jersey. I think you're on mute there. There you go.
Yeah, I don't have any questions at this moment. I'm just listening. Thank you.
Okay, we'll go to Mr. Kinzinger of Illinois.
All right, thank you. Let me get on the video here. There we go. First off, thank you all for being here. Very much appreciate it. All your good work, everything you're doing for the country. That's a really important issue. I mean, a couple things to say up front. First off, I think it's too much to call this a hoax. Secondly, though, I think it's too much to say that we absolutely know this happened, and therefore here should be the penalties. I've read every piece of intelligence at least offered to me, and you know, in terms of what level of confidence, that's not my expertise. That's up to the intelligence agencies. And I think the question of, you know, whether the president should or shouldn't be briefed, it's really, in my mind, an art and not a science. It's a matter of, when do you feel, whether it's the briefer or the intelligence experts, that you should brief a president on this? If it's not actionable, is it worth going to him? Well, if I was president, I would want to know, but not every president would or should. So I think a lot of the so-called scandal that we've been seeing here is not a scandal at all. I think it's just an art form. And unfortunately, you know, look, this goes, the prior questioner, Mr. Perry, mentioned about Soleimani. That was a confirmed bad guy that took confirmed action that killed Americans. I operated against him in Iraq, or against his people at least. And you know, there was opposition to that. And I think with something like this, it comes down to political stripes, unfortunately. If you're a Republican, you're going to say this was nothing. If you're a Democrat, you're going to say this is everything. And I just want to get to the bottom of this, because, you know, when we jump to conclusions, I don't think we're doing any good for our folks in the field. And but it seems to me that the only thing that Putin responds to is strength. Whenever Putin attempts a new maneuver, he waits to see the international community's response, and particularly the United States. And when nothing happens, he escalates. We've seen it time and again. We've seen it, for instance, in Syria multiple times, and everywhere else. And as I've said before, if the intelligence proved that the Russian officials approved of this bounty scheme, the United States and our international partners would need to respond forcefully. But the administration had the administration responded back in February, when the intelligence was even less certain, I fully believe my colleagues on the other side of the aisle would be holding a hearing bashing the administration on this. Mr. Morell, let me just ask you, during your time as CIA director, would you have recommended, you touched on it, but would you have recommended retaliatory actions against Russia with anything other than high probability? You talk using maybe medium probability, but when you discussing the fact that this is Russia, would you on a medium or anything short of high probability?
Yeah, I would. So high probability, high confidence to an intelligence analyst is not certainty that something has happened, but you're getting pretty close.
Yeah.
Medium to high confidence is pretty good as well. So CIA directors don't make recommendations to presidents about what they should do. they characterize the intelligence and our confidence in it. So if it was medium to high, I would tell the president that there's a very good chance that this happened. And it's up to you on how you want to respond.
Yeah, and I think this is the key to this too. We know that Russia has been meddling in Afghanistan. That's not a question. And I actually would have advocated for, action, whatever that looks like, back in 2013 or 2014. It's a bipartisan issue, right? I mean, it really is. This isn't just, the issue we're discussing is, was there particularly a bounty? Not is Russia involved, not is Russia doing things that can kill Americans, because they have been. And I've been advocating to push back against that for a long time. Mr. Brzezinski, let me ask you, what are some of the, what other states are supporting the Taliban, and have any of them placed bounties on the U.S. or coalition soldiers?
Sir, let me just add that I'd say, one point on the bounty issue. The fact that it's plausible that these bounties were placed on American soldiers in Afghanistan by Russia is testimony in itself that our policy towards Russia is inadequate in terms of deterring aggression. And so I want to make that important point. The fact that we're even discussing this underscores the point that we need to recalibrate our posture towards Russia across the whole spectrum.
Look, let me just say, I fully agree with you 100%. But and I would echo those comments. But then specifically, are there any other states that are doing things like this that we know about?
I don't have expertise on that, sir.
Okay, so you don't know if Iran or anything is involved in the same kind of situation. Okay, let me ask just another question of General Nicholson. During your time commanding U.S. I'm sorry?
Your time's expired. Do you have a?
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see the clock up there. I'll yield back. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll go to Mr. Connolly of Virginia.
Thank you. Can you hear me, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you. And thank you to the panel. Mr. Morell, on June 30th, the National Security Advisor, Mr. O'Brien, and the White House Press Secretary McNamee said the president had not been briefed on this intelligence due to disagreements among the intelligence community. Is that how intelligence sifts up to the president, that it's got to be in agreement or he doesn't hear about it?
No, sir. There are often pieces in the president's daily brief where one or two or three agencies believe something and another agency has questions about it. And those dissents are expressed in the piece. The reason for the dissents are expressed in the piece, and the reason why those dissents are important to the president are often expressed in the piece. So the reason not need a unanimous view to move forward.
So the explanation they gave doesn't really pass any kind of real test based on your own experience.
No,
That's
sir.
not how it works.
It's not how it works, sir.
Right. So there's reason to question the credibility coming out of the White House as to whether the president in fact got briefed. We know that the president doesn't like to read things, but that doesn't mean that it was not available to him. And it's not clear, from my understanding, that he was not briefed. Certainly the rationale given for why he wasn't briefed, as you just pointed out, Mr. Morell, does not have credibility. It's just not how the process works. And I would just say, even from a common sense point of view, if I were an intelligence official and I saw any kind of intelligence that seemed halfway credible, that the Russians had ramped up what they were doing in Afghanistan and were now paying a bounty on American lives to kill them, I'd sure as hell want to make sure the commander-in-chief knew about that. I'd take the risk that he knew about that, whether it was low, medium, or high credible, actionable intelligence. Mr. Brzezinski, I really appreciate what you had to say about Russia. The word that comes to my mind, because Dr. Wallinger said, we have to ask the question, why would Russia do this? I think that's the pertinent question. And for me, and I want you to react, you said Putin's a risk taker. I would also say he loves to push, probe, and expand boundaries. He's always checking what the boundaries are. And when you have a president who says, I believe Putin over my own intelligence community about Russian interference in the 2016 election, I'm willing to pull out 8,000 troops from Germany because I'm angry at Merkel for not coming to the G7 meeting. In fact, I want to invite Putin to that G7 meeting. And of course, having withdrawn from critical arms control agreements and the like, and now calling this intelligence a hoax, it seems to me that if I were Putin, I would tally all that up and say, I can operate with impunity with this administration. There are going to be very few consequences for pushing that envelope as far as I can push it. Do you think that's a fair appraisal of where we are in the current relationship with Vladimir Putin's Russia?
Sir, I'm on track with you on this. I would just characterize Putin not so much as a risk taker, but someone who has got very clear objectives, who's willing to assertively pursue those objectives, but who's also a pragmatist. As Celeste pointed out, as Dr. Wander pointed out, he picks his battles carefully. And as you pointed out, he'll probe. If he doesn't see pushback, he'll push further. If he sees forceful pushback, he'll back off. And that's what is a concern about this immediate issue at hand, which is the bounties issues, is now that it's out in the public domain, now that it's an issue that has gotten the attention it has, it is now incumbent upon the administration to clearly articulate to the Russians that this is completely unacceptable. So
and I would,
a forceful response, at least rhetorically, and as for more specific elements of a more aggressive or substantive response, that has to be determined based on the intelligence.
And I would add to what you just said, Mr. Brzezinski, conversely, there are consequences for not doing what you just said. When Putin hears equivocation and, well, we didn't know, and it's not clear, and we didn't have, actionable intelligence such that we could react at all, I think that gives him a flashing green light to do more of it and to look at other areas where he can do damage to the United States. And I think that's a very dangerous situation our president and this administration has put ourselves in. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Zeldin of New York. Oh, we can't hear your audio there, Mr. Zeldin. For some reason, I'm not hearing you. Why don't can we come back to you? Okay. Let me go. What I'm going to do is go to the next Republican and then go to a Democrat. All right. So Mr. Mast of Florida. Mr. Mast, are you there? Okay. Will the administrator tell me who the next Republican is that we can call on?
Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the ranking member. Thank you to the panelists, and just to echo what my friend Adam Kitzinger had said. I hope that our focus can be on number one, fixing the problem, getting our arms around this intelligence and fixing it. And we always can have time to go back and do an after-action report on what did or did not happen after the fact, after we fix the problem. So for the panelists, thank you for being here. And I just wanted to get your updated sense. I served in Ukraine as an FBI agent. It was my last international assignment. We were obviously very well aware of Mr. Putin's sinister motives when it comes to that region. We all knew that Mr. Putin has geographic dominance aspirations to reconstitute the USSR. Iran has religious dominance aspirations. China has economic dominance aspirations, and in many ways, they were operating, in some ways, I should say, in collaboration with one another. So if the panelists could just shed light and maybe provide us with an update on your assessment or your sense for the collaboration going on between Vladimir Putin and Syria, Iran, China, North Korea, and any other actors in the region.
I can speak to that, sir. Russia and Iran collaborate militarily in Syria and have for years. The Russian military is not a ground presence in Syria, and it relies on, as I suggested earlier, quasi-private military mercenary groups, and also coordination with other actors, including Iran in Syria. Russia strategically coordinates with China in areas where they have common interests in challenging American leadership, whether that is in the UN Security Council, in trying to prevent UN Security Council resolutions, for example, condemning the Assad regime in Syria, or many others. They share an interest in trying to revise the global liberal order in order to undermine American leadership. So you can find instances in which Russia cooperates with countries in areas that really affect, in a negative way, American leadership, American allies, and our interests.
Any other panelists have anything to add to that? Okay, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the ranking member. Thanks for holding this hearing, and thanks to the extraordinary testimony of our witnesses. Mr. Morell, I want to ask you about the reports that there was information in the presidential daily briefing that the Russians were putting a bounty on the heads of American troops. And we've heard lots of reasons why there was no reason the president should have been concerned about this, should have wanted to be concerned about this. But I just want to ask you, I want to take a step back and have you explain how the presidential daily brief is assembled. Can you do that for us?
Yes, sir. So there's a meeting every morning with the briefers there who just briefed that morning, and they provide their feedback on what happened. The most important part of that feedback are there any additional questions that the customers need answers to that would result in a piece the next day. And then the various parts of the intelligence community propose pieces for the next day and the days, the out days. And decisions are made about what's going to be in the book the next day and what's going to be in the book the day after that. Once those pieces are drafted and approved within the agency that writes them, they are coordinated across the intelligence community. And that's where you can get agreement. So you can get all agencies agree, or you can get dissents. You can get DIA and CIA think one thing and NSA thinks something else. So that's pretty much how the process works. I would add that within each agency, the process for getting a piece approved to even be sent out for coordination is extraordinarily rigorous, because at the end of the day, these views are not views of a Michael Morell. They're the views of the Central Intelligence Agency and the views of the United States intelligence community.
How do you react, Mr. Morell, to some of my colleagues coming back now to assert that this information shouldn't have been in there? One of my colleagues said it wasn't verifiable. One of them said it was biased human intelligence, and that as a result, it should have been clear back in February that this is nothing to be concerned about.
So if it was in the PDB, and I don't know that it was, but if it was in the PDB, it means at least one agency, one important agency, believed believed the information to be true at some level of confidence. So that's the response, right? Is that someone in the intelligence community believed that information to be true, and that's why it was in the PDB. It wouldn't be there otherwise.
And so before we even get to the question of low, medium, or high, which we discussed earlier, let's talk about the kind of information that it is. If there were information in the PDB that said that there was a threat against one of our ambassadors in Europe. And it didn't come up in the daily brief at the morning meeting with the president. What would happen then? Would someone raise it with the president?
So sure. So if it's not in the PDB, right, but the president needs to know it, then the briefer can raise it on their own, right? This is something else you need to know, Mr. President. Or the DNI who's sitting there as well, the Director of National Intelligence can raise it and say, Mr. President, there's something else you need to know. Or the Director of CIA, or anybody else in the room. I mean, one of the things that people forget here is that the president's briefer is the most junior person in the room. I was once that person. I was the most junior person in the room, right? So the National Security Advisor, White House Chief of Staff, Vice President, Director of National Intelligence, Director of CIA, they're all in the room. Any one of them are capable of saying, Mr. President, in addition to what's in your book, you also need to know this or that.
Who decide? Does the junior briefer decide what to report?
So in general, yes. In my case, I went in there every morning with the Director of Central Intelligence, George Tenet. So he wanted to know what additional materials I was going to give to the president or share with the president. So, he said yes or no to that. But in general, the briefers decide.
Mr. Morell, I would just close by pointing out that when one of the agencies says that the Russians are putting a bounty on the heads of American soldiers, that someone in that room, one would think, would care to share that information with the President of the United States. And when this information comes out months later, the response from the President of the United States, out of respect for the families who lost loved ones fighting in Afghanistan, should not immediately come to his own defense, but should try to get to the bottom of what happened. That's fixing the problem is not about the PDB. Fixing the problem is making sure that the president is looking out for protection of our troops and potential Russian efforts first and foremost. That's what I think this needs to be about, and I yield back.
Thank you. We're going to go to Ms. Wagner.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Chairman, for hosting this very important hearing on the absolute shocking allegations that Russia is paying Taliban-linked militants to attack our servicemen and women. If these reports are indeed true, we must take strong and swift action to show Russia that attacking Americans is never acceptable and will be met with a swift and strong response by the United States of America. Russia has proven that it will exploit any opportunity to undermine and roll back American influence, even at the cost of destabilizing regions and prolonging bloody conflicts. This is evident in its malign involvement in civil wars, unrest, and conflicts in places like Ukraine, Syria, and Venezuela. Russia's actions are reprehensible, and I am proud to have supported robust sanctions against the Putin regime. Dr. Wallander, you noted that reports of an alleged Russian bounty program with the Taliban indicate an escalation in Russia's long-running asymmetric competition with the United States. Does this illuminate any vulnerabilities in our deterrence against Russian asymmetric operations, and how can we restore the credibility of our deterrence?
Thank you very much for your question. I think that the vulnerability lays in our failure to track Russian activities closely enough and with enough confidence to be able to take counteractions. What do I mean by that? It's exactly by operating in this gray zone that Russia hopes to have the advantages of these operations without suffering the kinds of consequences we've talked about. Their exposure, American military commanders taking countermeasures, being called to account by political leadership, a whole potential financial sanctions. I would look at disruptive activities that the United States could undertake to complicate these kinds of operations. So we have to get serious about this, not only because of this incident, which I do think, if it is true, is an escalation because it exhibits a willingness to take risk for a direct connection between Russian action and American military fatalities. And it suggests that the constraints of risk aversion that we've referred to earlier might be being loosened.
Russian military intelligence, or GRU, is behind a string of attempted assassinations and coups, frankly, across Europe, including in the Balkans, where Russia is seeking to exploit existing divisions to slow or prevent regional countries from integrating into the European Union or NATO. I am deeply concerned that Russia is fueling ethnic divides in the interests of weakening Balkan states. Mr. Brzezinski, how can we work with our NATO partners to prevent the GRU from undermining progress in the Balkans?
Thank you, ma'am. I'll just add on Celeste's point that if you look back to 2006, how quickly President Putin backed off when he was confronted with the possibility of a direct red on blue engagement. That is, when he was confronted with the possibility he might have to shoot at American soldiers, compared to 2018 and 2018 in Syria, and today, where there are allegations of putting bounties on American soldiers, and in 2018, where Russian paramilitaries actually attacked a U.S. outpost. This shows how Russian aggression, assertiveness, and provocations have escalated. And if we're really going to curb, deter, contain, push back Russia's actions in this area, I think we have to have a much firmer posture across the board. We can't be willing to invite him or initiating invitations to G7s. The political isolation's got to be real and sustained. Our economic pressure has to be much harder. In addition to some of the sanctions that Celeste was talking about, I would seriously consider pulling Russia from SWIFT to really hammer its financial sector. Yes, this will cause pain and a lot of collateral economic damage on people who shouldn't be held responsible for Putin's actions in Russia. But that's a geopolitical reality. If you really want to shake up Putin, we have to shake up his political base, his political stability. And militarily, we need to be more prepared to push back against Russia. And I'm very concerned about our posture in Europe, because while we've made progress in recent years, it's still an inadequate posture to confidently deter Russian aggression, particularly in North, Central, and Eastern Europe.
Thank you, Mr. Brzezinski. I believe my time's expired, and I will yield back. I have several other questions, Mr. Chairman, and I will put them in for the record. And I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Wagner. And just for everybody, please, so that we can get to all the members on committee, if y'all, as you're asking questions, if you can glance on the grid at the time as it's coming down. For the witnesses, I know that y'all have a lot to say, and we appreciate your expertise. But if y'all can also be mindful of the time, so that we can get to everybody and help everybody ask y'all questions. All right. We're going to go to David Cicilline, and then I'm going to try to go back to Mr. Zeldin of New York right after that. David?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Mccaul, for calling this really important hearing. I want to begin by saying I disagree with my friend, Mr. Kinzinger, who said, if you're a Republican, this is nothing. If you're a Democrat, this is serious. If you're an American, the idea that there is actionable or there is intelligence that the Russians may have, in fact, been paying a bounty on the heads of our American soldiers is outrageous and demands a whole of government response. But I want to get first to this presidential daily brief, because some people have suggested that, it can be an innuendo, it can be a rumor. And so, Mr. Morell, I want to ask you, in order to get into the president's daily brief, isn't it a fact that there has to be a sufficient amount of evidence that it is a credible statement of fact? It's sort of the gold standard among the intelligence community. Rumors and innuendos don't make it into the president's daily brief.
So I'd agree with you. I would just change one word. I'd change fact to assessment, right? It's an assessment that Putin is providing these bounties. It may not be a fact, but it has to be credible in order to get in there. Yes, sir.
Right. So this idea of just rumors, unsubstantiated rumors, don't make it into the presidential daily brief. And I think the president has acknowledged that it was in the presidential brief, or at least he said he wasn't briefed on it, and he didn't read it, which presents its own problem. Kind of the consequences of a president who doesn't read the daily brief is, in and of itself alarming. But in addition to that, the National Security Advisor, Mr. O'Brien, acknowledged publicly that he had begun to develop, along with the other appropriate officials, a set of responses to this activity by the Russians, a set of options to present to the president. And is it fair to say that you don't go through the arduous process of developing a set of responses without having some confidence that the intelligence you've collected is accurate, credible, and worthy of action?
In my experience, yes, sir.
Mr. Morell?
I was just going to say, in my experience, sir, yes, you would need credible intelligence in order to start that process.
And so, we have, in this context, we have President Trump, who has fawned over President Putin. On the campaign trail, he repeatedly complimented Vladimir Putin. He denied that Russia interfered with U.S. elections. In 2017, in an interview with Bill O'Reilly, when he was asked about Putin being a killer, he said, there are a lot of killers. You think this country's so innocent? And then in 2018, at the Helsinki summit, Trump incredibly sided with Putin over our own intelligence community about Russia interfering with our elections. He's withdrawn from the Open Skies Treaty, which benefits Russia. He has proposed reducing U.S. forces in Europe. So it's in all of that context. Putin has annexed Crimea, remains steadfastly hostile to Ukrainian democracy in violation of international law. And just last week, we saw him again as a dictator extend his term in office until 2036. So it's in this context that this is reporting that the president failed to act or even condemn this action by the Russians is so outrageous. And so my first question is to you, Mr. Brzezinski. This, it seems to me, suggests the absence of a grand the president's not particularly interested in doing. But would it in fact be helpful if we actually had a strategy both to contain Russia when we needed to and to engage with them when we needed to? And what should that look like?
Sir, I missed part of your question, but I understood it as basically, do we have a strategy for dealing with Russian assertiveness?
And should we? Do we have one? Should we? And what should it look like?
I think right now, and unfortunately, I think from across administrations, we've really had kind of an ad hoc strategy, and one that has been reactive and has been incremental. And what we really need to be doing is leveraging the full spectrum of power that we have to deal with Russia. And that power includes our economic might. I think we ought to be leveraging more economic sanctions. I mean, think about it. We're a $17 trillion economy. Russia is somewhere between 1 and 2. We have, with the Europeans, it's a 34-to-1 advantage in GDP comparison. We ought to be hammering the Russian economy on this if we really want to be serious about convincing Russia to take a different course of action. On the political side, we have we can impose more aggressive political sanctions on Russia. And then also, as I pointed out, we need to adjust our military posture.
Thank you. And General Nicholson, my last question. If the allegations that are reported in the New York Times are true and that Russians place bounties on the heads of American soldiers, what should the President of the United States do to ensure that service members' families and the American people gain some comfort in knowing that we are doing everything we can to protect the men and women in uniform and to ensure that the Russians know that we will not tolerate this and we take this action very seriously?
What you just said, sir, we should let the American people know that we will do it. And then that would be visible by, as I mentioned in my recommendations, very highest levels of our government drawing a clear line that this is unacceptable.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Zeldin, hopefully we've got you now. I still can't hear you. Yeah, now it says you're on mute there. Yeah, it's not coming through. Yeah, sorry about that. I'll go to the next Republican, Curtis. Curtis? How about Burchett? Okay.
Can y'all hear me?
Yep. Oh, yep, we
Awesome.
can hear you.
I hate cutting in front of everybody, especially my colleague Lee Zeldin, who I make him look good on the baseball diamond. I'm a I'm a consensus fourth stringer on our baseball team, in case y'all didn't know that. And it's a pleasure being here with y'all, and thank y'all. I'm very interested in this topic. I've talked about it on the news. I've gotten busted from both sides on it, and I think it's pretty much known that Putin is a thug. I mean, I'm sure he quakes in his Gucci loafers when he hears that the 435th most powerful person in Congress isn't a fan of his, but I think he's a thug. I don't know why there's any fascination with either side on him. And we know that Russia's been helping the Taliban through political, maybe even material means since 2016. The Russians justify this because of the rise of the Islamic State. Now, I'm not sure if I say it right, but the Khorasan province and the ISKP and their view that the Taliban is less of a threat to their security. My question is this: what do the Russians gain by paying the Taliban to kill our troops if we have a shared enemy in the ISKP? And y'all just jump in. Ma'am, why don't you go, ladies first? I'm in the South, so that's.
Thank you, sir. I'm happy to address that. I think what the goal of Russian policy now, and General Nicholson pointed to this as well, is to get the United States out. There was a shift about half a decade ago where Russia was ambivalent. It saw some common interest in fighting fundamentalists and extremists. But after it invaded Ukraine, and the United States took firm action to lead, especially Europe, in sanctions and isolation, the Russian leadership evaluated that the threat of the United States being nearby militarily, not just NATO in Europe, but in the Middle East and in Central Asia. Remember, Russia worked to kick the US out of the air base in Manas, Kyrgyzstan as well. That was the goal, to get us out and to benefit from our departure, plain and simple, I think, by the period of this incident.
The rest of y'all, be curious what you have to say.
Yeah, I'll jump in, sir. General Nicholson here. I agree with Dr. Wallander. There was a lot of hedging activity, we would call it, I'd say, as it was unclear what the United States intentions were near the end of the Obama administration. And we had a stated intention to leave. We did see Pakistanis, Iranians, as well as Russians all getting involved, I think, to gain some influence in what was going to be the environment after we left, after the US and NATO left. So I think a part of it was motivated by a desire to gain leverage. And then another part is their legitimate concern about the spillover of terrorism into Central Asia and Russia. However, this was overstated, and this was part of their misinformation campaign, suggesting that the United States was supporting ISIS, and in fact was deliberately promoting this. So I think there's a combination, as with many things with Russia, of truth and fiction as they pursued their overall goal, which is to undermine us, to undermine NATO. They didn't want to see us be successful there, and they wanted us out of the region.
Thank you.
Congressman, if I could add just one thing, I agree with everything that Dr. Wallander and General Nicholson said. I would just add that this is about Afghanistan, but it's also about outside of Afghanistan. This is about reminding Americans that wherever you go in the world, you might not be safe. And they want us to think twice about sending troops anywhere. So this is a pretty broad policy as well as Afghan specific.
All right. Real quick, I'm running out of time, but what can we do to make sure this doesn't happen again? You know, we can talk all these broad statements, but bottom line, I'm in East Tennessee. We need to cut to the chase. Ma'am, what do you think? Bottom line, I've got 40 seconds, so 10 seconds apiece.
A political message, but also disruption operations. The GRU can operate like this because it can travel to Europe. it can use international financial institutions. And if it didn't have access to those resources, it wouldn't be able to engage in these operations.
General?
Sir, I would say, number one, strongly and clearly and unequivocally state this is unacceptable. And then secondly, the other things that they're interested in. This is why I suggest suspending any talk of withdrawing troops from Germany.
Mr. Morell, got 1 second.
Sir, I'd say you have to play to Putin's fears. And what he fears is his middle class coming out into the streets of Moscow and saying they want change and they want him to go away. And that's why I agree fully with Mr. Brzezinski that the sanctions need to be broad-based and should not be targeted. They should be broad-based.
Great. Thank y'all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate all y'all.
Thank you.
And I actually miss you guys in person. I know y'all. Yeah, it's not the same without me being there live. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and ranking member as always. Good seeing you, brother.
Thank you. Ms. Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank my colleagues and the panel for giving us very detailed discussion about the issue of bounties, but I want to look at this from a bigger picture as we've started to do. I think Mr. Brzezinski said that our policy over several administrations has been ad hoc and reactive. And we know that. You just go back to Obama, we had the reset with the red button. That was pretty optimistic. People thought we were going to accomplish a lot, but it fizzled pretty fast and then ended up with Crimea and sanctions and adoptions being denied and interference in elections. So now we got a new president and a new policy, if you can call it a policy. Nobody's come up with a name for it because it's so confusing. The president talked about Putin in his campaign and praised him, but then on the other hand, he said, I've been more aggressive against Russia than any other president. And then I think you, Mr. Chairman, laid out all the things that have happened in recent days that show how the president feels about Mr. Putin. We've heard some grand strategies now for what our policy should be, but I don't see any of those being put into effect by this administration, judging from his recent behavior. But I'm optimistic. I think we're going to have a new president here in a few months. So I'd like to talk about what difference that will make. Will that cause Putin to change his policy as he deals with the new president? The fact that he's going to be there till 2036, he thinks, will that affect his behavior? How can we now get back into multilateral relationships to change the new reset or a new policy? And how can we more effectively deal with his plausible deniability, like the Wagner group that he often hides behind? So given those major changes that I anticipate will come in November, could you kind of address how you think that will affect what our policy towards Russia will be?
If I could, I'll take a stab.
Thank you.
Whether it's a Trump administration or a Biden administration, there are four kind of elements I would have for an effective Russia strategy. One is to kind of ratchet up political isolation of the Putin regime so he doesn't get political legitimacy and stature through fora like the G7. Second, I would enhance our military readiness in key frontiers. I focus most on Central Europe, but that's one area we ought to be continuing to enhance our military readiness, particularly for high-intensity conflict. Third, as was mentioned several times, we ought to enhance our economic pressure, really impose economic pain on Russia. And then fourth, kind of following a point that was inferred by Director Morell and Dr. Wallander, we ought to really think about kind of strategy of disruption. In the same way that Putin has been mucking around in our politics and the politics of our allies and partners, we ought to be leveraging his own political weaknesses by leveraging our asymmetric advantages and asymmetric tools like cyber warfare and information operations. His political stature isn't as strong as he would like it to be. And the more we could create a certain amount of uncertainty within Russia about his own political well-being, the more likely he's going to be to focus inward. So the combination of this external pressure and a strategy of disruption that affects his internal stability, I think, is in order for a more effective Russia policy.
Dr. Wallander?
I would agree with what Mr. Brzezinski said in terms of the focus of the strategy. And I would just observe also that if you're going to focus on isolation, greater defense spending and better planning, especially in Europe, but not only in Europe, and economic pressure. The United States needs to do it in coordination with allies and partners, because otherwise it's not effective. Sanctions escape is easier for Russia to do if the United States isn't coordinated with Japan, the other members of the G7, and certainly with Europe, given the importance of the European economy to Russia. So we need to rebuild those alliances and partnerships, both because they're good for America, but if we want to have an effective strategy of coping with Putin's Russia, we have to do it with those strong allies and partners.
Thank you. Director Morell, any addition?
Ma'am, just to answer your direct question about Vice President Biden, I think the important thing is that Putin will test him immediately. And the Vice President will need to respond along the lines that all four of us are suggesting in order for Putin to be constrained. And if the Vice President doesn't respond that way, then Putin will see an open field ahead of him. So he will test within the first few months a new president.
Okay.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Titus. We're now going to try one more time. Mr. Zeldin, I think he changed computers, and it may be working for him now.
Chairman, do you have me?
I do.
All right. So thank you, Chairman. First off, I'd like to state that I view Russia in many ways as an adversary of the United States. Vladimir Putin thinks he's 7 feet tall. If he could have his way, he'd put the USSR back together again. That's where I come from. But first, I'm approaching this from a position of facts. I've been trying over the course of the hearing to follow a bunch of bad assumptions to take the story into different directions, and it's unfortunate. But first off, before I get into some of that, to follow up on that exchange just now, as the question was presented conclusively that Joe Biden was going to get elected in November, and how would that impact his relationship with Vladimir Putin? If we're going to go there, to complete the record, yesterday he released a 110-page agenda, and nowhere in the 110 pages does it mention Russia or terrorism once. It does mention other nations and obviously a lot of other priorities. So to help answer that question of my colleague. To also help clean up one thing that Mr. Morell said about declaring the briefer in the room as a junior briefer. This is a 30-year CIA briefer. The woman who briefed the president is a 30-year career staffer. Next, sir, what happened? No, thank you. Please, it's my time. Now you had your opportunity, so we'll clean up a few things. Next, we're following what really was the Susan Rice version in her op-ed in the New York Times. That is that there was compelling evidence. There was a conclusion based on compelling evidence that Russia placed a bounty on U.S. service members and that the president was briefed. Now, I don't know, Ms. Wallander, if your assumption that you come into this hearing is following the Susan Rice assumption. I don't know what you might disagree with of what Susan Rice wrote in her op-ed, but having known the rest of the facts and not playing along with story time here at this hearing, there are important facts that should be understood so we can have a productive conversation. So there was a PDB that was given in written form to the President of the United States. In that PDB, there was a concern expressed that is an appropriate topic of this discussion today in this hearing. In it was also a dissent. That 30-year career CIA briefer shows up at the briefing and chooses not to brief that information because she disagrees with it. So the president was never told that in the briefing. Now, I'm having trouble playing along with ignoring the facts. To call it a junior briefer and ignore her 30 years of service in the CIA. I have trouble playing along with the reality that there was some kind of a conclusion on this based on compelling evidence that there wasn't a dissent and the president was told this. So with all that being said, with a couple minutes I have left, first off, General Nicholson, I have a tremendous amount of respect for you. Thank you for your service to our country. We've spent multiple Christmas days in Afghanistan. You've sacrificed a ton for your country, and as you know, I have a tremendous amount of respect for you. And actually, it's been on those trips with you and your team where I learned a lot about Russian interest in Afghanistan and the way that they meddle with the Taliban and otherwise. So I know that you are a subject matter expert on it. I just want to hear your thoughts on the fact that there was classified information that was leaked to the New York Times and how that impacts the process.
Right. Obviously, compromising information is not helpful. Having said that, as you know from our conversations there, and thank you for your many visits to the theater and for checking on the troops and the dialogue with us. We have been watching the Russians for some time, and we are concerned about their behavior. And so having this hearing, having this conversation, getting this up on the radar screen, I think is a form of pushback on Russian behavior. And this opportunism that the Russians have demonstrated in Afghanistan and elsewhere, in my experience, militarily, when we respond, when we identify they're trying to exploit an opportunity, and we respond effectively, that's one of the ways that we can cause him to look elsewhere, if nothing else, and to dial down what they're doing. So I thank the members for having this hearing and getting this on the screen. They'll be watching this, and they will know that we're watching them.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Felton.
Doesn't want to answer the question. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Morell, I know you wanted to say something. Your words were directly addressed. If you want to make a quick response, that would be fine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Zeldin misrepresented my statement. I did not say she was a junior officer. I said she was the most junior officer in the room. That is a very significant difference.
Okay. Thank you. All right. We're going to go to Mr. Liu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank all their panelists for being here today. I think it's very instructive to know what the White House has not denied. The White House has not denied that the CIA assessed that Russia paid bounties to the Taliban to kill US troops. The White House has not denied that the CIA made this assessment with a medium level of confidence. The White House has not denied that this information was included in the president's daily brief in February. The main excuse from the White House is that Donald Trump was not orally briefed on this issue. But that excuse has now gone away because for at least nearly 2 weeks, the president has seen the news coverage on this issue, first coming out of the New York Times and then being confirmed by the Washington Post, by NBC, by the Wall Street Journal, and multiple other press outlets. And the president has yet to utter a single word condemning Vladimir Putin. But the president has found time to criticize NASCAR driver Bubba Wallace. The president has found time to play golf on numerous outings. What kind of message does that send to Vladimir Putin? And I've heard some of the strong comments from my Republican colleagues, and I appreciate them, that Russia is not our friend. Well, those are just empty words if you can't even condemn Donald Trump for not saying a single about Russia placing bounties to kill our troops. And so, Ms. Morell, I have some questions for you. You had said that if intelligence had a medium level of confidence or higher that this is happening, you would expect the U.S. in a normal.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I've heard some of my Republican colleagues use the word, verify or validate. That's not how intelligence works at all, right? You just have confidence levels. It's nearly impossible to verify or validate a fact. For example, when Obama sent in the strike to kill Osama bin Laden, no one was 100% sure that Osama bin Laden was there. Isn't that right? You just had confidence levels in intelligence generally.
Yes, sir. You never have certainty in intelligence.
Okay. And based on the numerous non-denials from the White House, it's very clear this is not a hoax. And so what I want to understand is, and this is from any of the panelists, what kind of message is this sending to Russia and Vladimir Putin when the President of the United States cannot still utter a single word condemning Russia, not just for the bounty program, but just for generally arming the Taliban, right? No one disputes that. And the president can't even condemn that. So what kind of message do you think, panelists, that sends to Russia?
So I'll jump in first here, Congressman. Vladimir Putin, one of his strategic tactics, or one of his tactics, is to divide us as a people, is to have us at each other's throat. So he must be very pleased with the arguments we're having politically about this issue.
Well, so let me follow up on that. I find it fascinating that so many Republicans are bending over backward to give Russia the benefit of the doubt. I do not understand that. I previously served in active duty in the United States military. It's very clear that Russia is not our friend and Putin is not our buddy. We should not be giving Russia the benefit of the doubt. We should be giving the CIA the benefit of the doubt. I also want to make another point, which is the Republicans will bring up, for example, Soleimani and how there's all this intelligence about him. Well, yes, and Democrats agreed. There was a lot of intelligence on him that he was a bad guy. That was never the dispute. Intelligence was never the dispute. The dispute was there an appropriate use of force authorization to take him out? I believe there was not. And second, what were going to be the consequences if we did that? In this case, this is an issue regarding intelligence. The CIA has made this assessment, and the President of the United States still has not been able to condemn Vladimir Putin. I cannot understand that. And for Republicans who remain silent on this, you are rewarding Putin. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Liu. I'll now go to Mr. Keating from Massachusetts.
Well, thank you. I had a question for Dr. Wallander, but for the rest of the panel as well. When we look at what we do in response to Russia, we're always first looking at sanctions, and certainly sanctions, including individual sanctions, should be explored, particularly with some of the oligarchs, I believe. But the question is this. I'd like your comments on how much more effective it is to work in concert with these responses, particularly with our European allies, than just this go-it-alone strategy when we do get around and the president does get on board, sometimes reluctantly, to these sanctions. I mean, strengthening NATO, working harder and more visibly for Ukraine independence and reform, working on energy issues, financial transparency issues, and money laundering issues are important as well. These are the things we should take an across-the-board approach in terms of reacting to Russia's malign activities, and how important it is to work in concert, I believe. But can you reflect on your experience in the go-it-alone versus an allied approach?
Well, thank you very much, sir. In order to be effective with economic or financial sanctions, in the case of Russia, the United States have to coordinate with Europe to be effective for a couple of reasons. One is the volume of trade between Russia and Europe far exceeds that of the United States. US trade with Russia is something like 2% of our global trade. So to have impact, you have to look at Europe. Second, a lot of Russian financial transactions end or go through Europe. So if you don't coordinate with Europe on financial banking, financial institution transactions, there are workarounds that the Russians are very clever. You know, I sometimes say if they put as much energy into into running a real market economy, their economy would be a lot more successful. They're really good at workarounds. And so if you get to do those workarounds without being able to the United States coordinating with Europe, you're just not going to be effective. And the last point I'd like to make is I agree with Mr. Brzezinski that we should be looking at, if you want impactful economic sanctions, that you should be looking at sectoral sanctions. You can only sanction the oligarchs so many times. Many of the oligarchs aren't actually not politically influential or even close to the Kremlin. So for impact, sectoral sanctions are important, and targeted sanctions on the defense and security elite that is so core to the Putin leadership. If you want to be effective, you need to think in terms of targeting those areas.
And in terms of the Wagner Group, and you look at their activities in the Crimea, Syria, now in Libya, parts of Africa, what theaters that we may not be looking at where you would be keeping a watchful eye on the Russians going forward?
Going forward, I think we need to look at Central Asia for many of the reasons General Nicholson pointed to. I think that I'm concerned also about that the Russian government may use the Wagner Group for deniable training of some countries in Europe or in the Middle East. And once they're there, they tend to have influence, and then they tend not to play by the international rules of the game. So I think beginning to treat the Wagner Group as more quasi than private would strengthen the ability of the United States to counter these kind of disruptive asymmetric operations.
Lastly, in the hearings we had this week in our subcommittee, they stressed the importance to our witnesses of not moving away from the option of dealing directly with the Russian people, giving them information. Many of Putin's activities are not well received in Russia. In fact, if they did know the truth instead of what they're getting, it would become a domestic problem for him. You believe that is a very important approach we should take too?
Well, Russia's disapproval ratings have been growing. Its approval ratings have been falling as a combination of economic challenges and also the challenges of the COVID crisis in Russia. So there is evidence that Russians do pay attention and do have views of their leadership. And there's also evidence that Russians have, although official media sources inside of Russia are constrained, Russians actually get their information from a wide variety of platforms that are available to them. And so,
Time left, I'm sorry, Doctor, but you'll back. But thank you so much for being here with us today, to all our witnesses. You'll back.
Congressman Malinowski, we can turn to you, sir, if you want to begin sharing.
So it's Mr. Phillips next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. I'll start with a few obvious truths, one of which is I'm terribly disappointed that Secretary Pompeo once again chooses not to be with us, stonewalls our efforts to provide important oversight on some terribly important issues that we and the rest of the world face. I'm terribly disturbed by Vladimir Putin's ongoing provocations and aggression, all with impunity, and particularly disturbed and disgusted by the possibility that Russians provided bounties to the Taliban to kill American servicemen and women. I will not try to continue the litigation of whether it's true or not. We've done so, but I want to turn to a couple of questions. One of which is perhaps General Nicholson, if you might begin. Is it even possible that the GRU operates independently of Vladimir Putin?
I'll give you my perspective with great respect for Director Morell and Dr. Walder and Dr. Brzezinski. They understand the Russians extremely well. There's an almost, my perception, there's an almost feudal set of relationships inside Russia. On one level, you could view it that way. People like to deliver outcomes to the center, to the czar, if you will, or to Putin, that they think he will like, that will curry favor. So there is a dimension to this where people will act independently on what they think the boss wants and deliver that to him. And so I think that it is possible that there can be independent actors within this system doing things that others in the system might view as reckless or irresponsible.
Thank you, sir. Do any of our witnesses see it differently?
I agree exactly with General Nicholson's analysis. I would point out that the GRU has engaged in multiple operations that have been exposed, and they've not been pulled back. And so from that, I take it that while those operations may not have been ordered, they may have been about pleasing the boss, may have been about creative implementation of general directives. We nonetheless should hold the Russian leadership accountable because they haven't, if they didn't like it, they didn't stop it. So therefore, they own it.
Well said. I couldn't agree more. Some of you have spoken. Director Morell, you spoke about Putin's greatest fear is his middle class in Russia turning against him. Mr. Brzezinski, you talked about the need for a strategy of disruption and creating uncertainty. I think we would all agree that if we intend to do so, and we should, it must be in conjunction with our allies. And I'd welcome perspectives from each of you in my remaining time relative to the state of affairs with our allies. Are we in a position right now with our relationships to do so? Do our allies trust us, or are those relationships compromised and perhaps presenting a challenge to some cooperation in that respect?
I'll jump in here, sir. Having led a 41 nation coalition that has built around the core of NATO, I would tell you, having served in NATO multiple times, it's one of our most important sources of strength in the national security arena. And the protection, if you will, of that cohesion and that strength of the alliance is paramount for our national security. And I know we in uniform took that very seriously. And indeed, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, if you will, especially when it comes to the legitimacy of our actions. It's not just adding up GDPs, adding up military capability, which is significant and gives us enormous strategic advantage over Russia. It's the legitimacy that comes with having 41 nations together in Afghanistan. That is an important source of strength.
But sir, if I might ask, would you say that those relationships are less strong than they perhaps were as short as a few years ago?
Candidly, as a leader within NATO, I was concerned that some of the comments we saw and some of the pressure being put on key allies within NATO it risks our cohesion. Having said that, it is true that many of our allies have not met their obligation to spend 2% of their GDP on their defense, and their readiness has suffered because of it. So it's not a black or white issue. I mean, the allies, given the threat posed by Russia, do need to invest more in their readiness and in their modernization. The way we go about it, though, I think needs to reinforce our cohesion, not undermine.
Thank you, sir. Director Morell, I'd welcome your perspective on our allies, our relationships, and whether that's been eroded over the last few years.
So, sir, I've had many conversations with foreign officials who I used to deal with, and almost to a person, whether in Europe, the Middle East, or Asia, they're concerned about their relationship with the United States. And they tell me that because of that, they need to hedge, and that hedging includes increased conversations with both China and Russia. So I hear that almost constantly.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. I am going to recognize myself at this point, and I wanted to start with to go back to a pretty basic question to you, Mr. Morell, and that is, what is the standard for including a piece of information in the president's daily brief? It's more than just that the information is true or likely true. It has to be important. Isn't that the case?
Yes, sir. It has to be important to the national security of the United States of America.
Right. So if this information was included in the president's daily brief, that would mean that the intelligence community made a judgment that it was important enough for the president to know. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And we don't actually know why the intelligence briefer chose not to orally brief. So any of that is speculative at this point.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, when something is important and it comes to the White House, but there are gaps in the analysis or potentially differences of opinion about the level of confidence, then one of the things the White House can do is to go back to the intelligence community and ask for a deeper dive. And we know that in this case, that did happen, that Mr. Radcliffe produced a sense of the community memorandum upon being asked by the White House. But what strikes me as odd about that is that it seems as if that if a White House, if a national security advisor felt a real desire to get to the bottom of a piece of information like this, wouldn't he have asked for that deeper dive immediately? In this case, several months ago when it was first brought to the attention of the White House?
Sir, I would think so. I don't understand the timing in this case, but yes, I would think so.
Okay. And are you concerned that the timing might have been related to the media reports rather than to a sense of urgency to get to the bottom of the intelligence?
Sir, I just don't know the timing, so I can't answer that.
Understood. And let's get back to the more important question of the response here. Now, we've heard from Secretary Pompeo. We wish he were here to tell us in person, but we've heard from him that he has raised Russian support for the Taliban on several occasions with his counterpart, I assume Mr. Lavrov, in the Russian government. Ms. Wallander, knowing that, would you say that President Putin would take such expressions of concern seriously if they're only coming from the Secretary of State and they're never coming directly to him from the President of the United States?
One of the things that is clear is that the Russian leadership pays close attention to what it's hearing from different senior levels from the US government. And when they get mixed messages, they use that to their advantage and cherry pick the messages they want to hear from the messages they don't want to hear. So I think it does matter that if it is the case, and I don't know if it is the case, that they have not heard a consistent, clear, strong message on concern in this area from several senior leaders of the U.S. government. They would read into that that there isn't they don't need to worry about it, and it's not a strong U.S. expression of concern.
And they do recognize the president speaks for the United States above all others. I mean, we do know, we don't know exactly what was discussed, but we do know, because it's been publicly reported, that President Trump has spoken to President Putin on the phone something like a half dozen times in the last couple of months. That in and of itself is a little bit odd or out of the ordinary, wouldn't you say, from your experience?
The frequency of calls isn't necessarily unusual. President Obama spoke frequently with Vladimir Putin during the escalation in the Ukraine crisis in order to be able to let him know we knew what was happening and what we were planning to do to counter Russian actions. So the frequency itself might not be. It would depend on what the content of the message was.
Right. But if Pompeo is saying, I'm concerned about what you're doing in Afghanistan, and the president is saying, I'd love to share intelligence with you on counterterrorism, I want to invite you to the G7, I want to have a good relationship with you, and can you believe this Russia hoax and all of that stuff, how seriously do you think Mr. Putin would take any expressions of concern from the State Department?
If that were the content of the messages, that would be a very mixed message, and the expressions of concern from the State Department would not rise to the level of serious.
Okay, thank you so much. My time is up, and I'd like to recognize Mr. Allred. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I really want to thank our panel for their excellent testimony and your excellent written testimony. I think that many of my colleagues have covered very ably a lot of the ground that I wanted to discuss. But I want to begin by noting that I have not been privy to the intelligence around this incident. But I agree with Mr. Brzezinski that fact that bounties are even plausibly been placed on American servicemen and women shows that our policy towards Russia is at the very least completely ineffective at deterring their aggression. And we know, as General Nicholson has noted, that the Russians have provided arms and support to the Taliban that have been used against American service members. So whether we accept this intelligence or not, or whether the president was briefed on this particular instance or not, the president and this administration are clearly on notice as to Russian intentions against us in Afghanistan, and certainly may have American blood directly on their hands. And last November for Thanksgiving, I was in Afghanistan visiting our embassy, Bagram, went to some of our forward operating bases where our Rangers are training and working with the next generation of Afghani officers. And when I think about those young service members who are working with those young Afghans, and I think of our president repeatedly praising Vladimir Putin, offering ventilators, saying that he believes Putin over our intelligence agencies, and of course trying to get them readmitted to the G7, among many other things that we could list. It's incomprehensible. And I can find no strategic goal in it. I have no rationale behind it. And so I'm left wondering what could possibly be motivating these actions. But my role, and I think our role on this committee, is to try and inform policy and inform our constituents and inform the American people as to what we can do. And while this president may not act, we know that Congress has acted several times during this term to try and take steps, and we were willing to do more. And so I do want to ask, what has worked for us in a multilateral, multinational approach in the past to check Russian aggression? What steps have worked? And are those mechanisms still effective? Is it necessary for us to find some other mechanisms? And I'll ask that to the entire panel, perhaps beginning with Dr. Wallander.
Thank you for your question. We do have some evidence of what is effective. In the summer of 2014, when Russia provided surface-to-air missiles to the so-called separatists in Ukraine, and that missile was used to shoot down the Malaysian airliners number 17, it was very quickly exposed publicly, and the Europeans, in coordination with the United States, imposed significant sanctions on the Russian economy. And the Russians both withdrew those capabilities and stopped, they didn't stop their intervention, but they stopped the escalation of delivery of equipment that they'd been engaged in and pulled it back and went more covert and more deniable, and that affected their operational effectiveness. And so they are sensitive to what we do and the costs we impose. Those costs vary by circumstance. I can't tell you, I can't lay out a map of what it would be in every circumstance. My colleagues have suggested some, we've talked about some. But I think the important answer for you is that we know that the Kremlin is cost sensitive and does respond when we are clear and firm in our policies.
Mr. Morell, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I agree 100%.
Mr. Brzezinski?
So I kind of reiterate this way: when we are committed to our values, that denies opportunity to autocrats like Putin to kind of undercut political cohesion, to undercut the cohesion among our allies. It reduces his motivation to kind of push against liberal democracy and replace it with authoritarian nationalism. When we're steadfast in our military resolve, Putin will be more cautious. We've demonstrated that repeatedly. When we're committed to our allies and partners, we don't abandon them in the field or withdraw our forces from their territories, Putin is less likely to push against them. And if we're steadfast in our leveraging our economic power, Putin doesn't have any capability to match that, but we have to exercise it.
Well, my time is up, but General, thank you for your service, and I'm sorry we didn't get a chance for you to weigh in. If you have anything you want to add, perhaps the chairman will allow you a few seconds.
It's fine if you have anything to add, sir.
Thanks, Chairman. I wanted to add that war is more like a wrestling match than a chess game. And so while discussions of confidence levels and assessments are going on the ground, leaders are taking actions immediately to protect our service members and to respond and to fill in any gaps. If we don't know with confidence, well, why not? Well, let's try to cover that gap. So I'd say our teammates, our colleagues that are out there on the front lines right now, they're doing everything they can to protect our service members, and they're adapting to this. The one thing I'd add on responding is back to the power of the alliance. So the legitimacy that comes with 41 nations saying, hey, this is unacceptable. You don't threaten the U.S. and its coalition partners on the ground. That does have power, and it shouldn't be underestimated. Thank you for the question, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well said. I now recognize Mr. Levin of Michigan.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the ranking member as well for this really important hearing, and I want to thank all the panelists. We go through a lot of hearings. You all are really outstanding witnesses, and I appreciate it. I want to start with you, Mr. Morell. You said in your testimony that in your experience, quote, even if it was only vaguely clear that the Russians might be paying bounties to Taliban-associated militants for killing American soldiers, that information would have made its way to the highest levels of the U.S. government, including the president, before the analysts concluded their work. Would you tell us why information like this would have been run up the chain so quickly, even if it was only vaguely clear?
Because of its significance, sir. We're talking about bounties on the heads of American soldiers, and the significant strategic step forward that would suggest for Putin's activities against us.
Thank you.
I worked with a number of national security advisors in my time. I don't think a single one of them would not have told the president this information when the national security advisor first heard it, when they first read the raw intelligence.
And regardless of politics, obviously, this is we're all patriots, right? I mean, it's just about our country's interests.
Yes, sir.
And protecting our. Okay, so Secretary of Defense Esper is actually testifying before another committee right now. And I understand that he said, and I'm quoting, to the best of my recollection, I have not received a briefing that included the word bounty, end quote. He then said that he was briefed on intelligence reports that Russia made, quote, payments, end quote, to militants. If this happened during your tenure, is there any chance that this wouldn't have been brought to the Secretary of Defense's attention? And what would the Secretary likely have done knowing this, that payments were made in this way to militants to attack our soldiers?
Two thoughts, sir. One is the Secretary of Defense is a recipient of the PDB. So if it was in the PDB, the Secretary of Defense should have read it or should have been briefed on it. Second is the Secretary of Defense has, of all the cabinet members, the most interest here in making sure that this is run to ground, in making sure that his soldiers are, his or her soldiers are well cared for and protected. So I think they would speak the loudest for something to be done here.
Thank you. General Nicholson, I want to ask you a question, sir, about, and I don't mean to be naive, but I really don't know. You've led our troops at every level and our coalition partners. When news like this happens, do our troops find out about it, that this idea that there may have been bounties on them and that the president isn't doing anything about it? I mean, do they hear about this?
Thank you, sir, for asking. Information that has to do with what we would call force protection, extremely important, comes right to the top of the list. Be it because casualties, friendly casualties, they call it American, are going to affect the political will to sustain the efforts. There's a military reason you do that. And then, of course, there's the moral obligation you have to all of the members of your team to protect them. So this is critically important. I think our service members understand that their chain of command, I mean, starting with their leaders on the ground, are committed to their protection. And to be honest, studies of military units and all that, it's usually your nuclear group that's the most important and your immediate. And I think there'll be no question in the minds of those service members that their immediate group and their leadership, General Miller in Afghanistan, are going to be doing everything they can to ensure they're protected.
Everything they can. And then if they have a question of, if it seems in publicly available information that the way up the chain that someone may not be looking out for them, I mean, I just worry about the morale of our troops and their, it just concerns me. Again, not to do with politics, but just, I mean, they're out there defending our country, for God's sakes.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, sir, in terms of our internal strength and cohesion is one of our greatest sources of strength and effectiveness on the battlefield, and the unwavering commitment and all of the members. I know all of you have been enormous supporters of our troops in the field. We deeply appreciate that. So sure, it does cause some head scratching from time to time when you see things like this.
Yeah.
Well,
thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Levin.
And thanks for your service. Thank you. I yield, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Congressman Levin. And I'd now like to recognize the member of our committee who in a past life might have been the person analyzing and briefing this information, Congresswoman Spanberger.
Well, not to make light, thank you, Mr. Malinowski, of a prior comment, but at the time that I left the agency, I was far too junior to have the role of the President of the United States, not to mention I was on the operations side of the house, but I am grateful to all of our witnesses for being here today, for the breadth of information, knowledge, and commitment to service and our nation that you have demonstrated throughout your careers and continue to demonstrate. As a member of Congress, one of my very top priorities is keeping our service members safe. I am personally furious over the allegations that Russia seems to have further endangered our men and women in uniform serving in Afghanistan by putting bounties on their heads with Taliban-linked militants, asking them to target them. I have been grateful to hear strong denunciations among many of my colleagues during this hearing, but I would urge many of them to go one step further. I would love to hear them call upon the White House to do the same, to stand up to Russia. And this gets me to my first question, which I'll direct at you, General Nicholson. You have raised concerns about Russia and its support for the Taliban for a number of years. And then separately, we've seen that President Trump has held off in condemning Putin in a whole variety of ways. He's offered him intelligence. He's publicly sided with him over the intelligence community. He's advocated for Russia to join the G8. He's repeatedly given him praise. And then most notably, he hasn't issued what I think is an important and necessary step, which is if this is true, Russia will see the full force and strength of the United States across the board, politically, economically, and wherever else that may take us for us to protect our U.S. service members. That's what I would like to see. But my question for you, General, is when we see these patterns and patterns of nefarious behavior by Putin and Russia, but then also patterns of an administration that isn't standing up to escalatory behavior, either directed at our country or other Western allies, what do you think that portrays to Russia? And what sort of calculation do you anticipate or do you assess that they might be making, given the pattern of behavior that they are put up against?
Thank you, ma'am. Thanks for your service, and thanks for your focus on this issue. I do think clearly Putin and Russia are targeting the cohesion of NATO, and so many of the actions they've taken, not just in this regard, are targeted at that. And if they can erode the cohesion of NATO, if they can convince just one member, one voting member, to not invoke Article 5 if they were to threaten an ally, clearly these are the kinds of scenarios we spent a lot of time looking at during my multiple assignments in NATO as a flag officer. So I do think they are trying to erode the cohesion, and they're doing it in multiple ways, as other Witnesses have spoken about eloquently in terms of the information operations in particular. And we've seen this in America. So I do think this is something we need to be concerned about. And the ways we can reinforce cohesion in NATO are leveraging the system. I'll give you a quick example. Don't mean to take up too much time, but when you look at the threats initially to the eastern states of the alliance after the invasion of Ukraine and the actions that NATO's taken then, it took a little while. It's a large alliance, but we now have alliance troops stationed in the east. We have large exercises in the east. We have a regular rotation of forces to the east. Those nations in the east have improved their readiness and posture, new weapon systems, etc. It tends to take longer in an alliance. Everything's harder in an alliance, but the alliance at the end of the day is, in my view, the effective mechanism to respond with. That helps.
Thank you. And in your testimony, you had noted that mistakes and miscalculations can in fact lead to war, and they can be particularly dangerous when it comes to our relationship with Russia. What does it tell you, looking at these allegations, that Russia is willing to risk potentially? And I'm going to caveat it heavily like a former intelligence officer would. If these things are true, what would that demonstrate to you that they might be willing to risk, given what some of their goals are, among them, disrupting the cohesion of NATO?
And I'll throw in the same caveat on if this is true, but I would say, one, it's a miscalculation and a mistake. And so number one, that we wouldn't find out about it. I mean, it's clumsy execution. It's poor execution. Their tradecraft was pretty bad if we have received these reports. If they trusted criminal proxies, and those criminal proxies dealt with Taliban criminal proxies. Well, they've essentially entrusted the foreign policy of Russia to criminal proxies in Afghanistan. And that was a real miscalculation and very sloppy on their part. What it would say, though, is that they made a mistake, in my view. So there was a miscalculation that they could pull this off, and a mistake in that they have risked their strategic consequences for this essentially tactical action. And the final point I make is, when Vladimir Putin's approval ratings are the lowest they've been in 20 years, do you really want to risk economic sanctions against Russia over something like this? What is the cost-benefit analysis? And that's what leads me to believe, again, poorly conceived, sloppily executed, if it turns out to be true.
Thank you very much, General Nicholson. I appreciate your comments. And I think reflecting back on the patterns of behavior, I think there's an element here that's unfortunate in that they might have also made the judgment that they wouldn't face the level of wrath or retaliation that they would have faced under any other administration that learned of allegations of bounties being put on the heads of U.S. service members. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much. And then finally, would like to recognize Representative Houlihan for what I believe will be our last round of questions.
Thanks, and I do apologize for being late. I was at the hearing that Representative Levin was referring to, where Secretary Esper mentioned that he had not heard of bounties, but had heard of payments for the lives of soldiers and sailors. And I just wanted, for the record, to read the definition of a bounty, which is a sum paid for killing or capturing a person. And so I don't think that we should be getting ourselves caught up in semantics. I also really want to make sure that I say for the record that were this intelligence, uncertain as it appears to be about another malign actor such as North Korea or Iran, we would not be having this conversation about trying to fall over ourselves to explain why this is either not real or actionable intelligence or not something to worry about. And so I would love to know also from Dr. Wallander or Mr. Morell, if you wouldn't mind just telling me a little bit about what's in it for Russia to offer a bounty on lives of soldiers and sailors. Why would they want to potentially escalate tensions between the U.S. and Russia? Did they expect to be caught or found out? If you could kind of try and characterize for me and for others, why would this happen, and why is this in fact an escalation?
Well, thank you for your question. It's a great question, and it cuts to the heart of the discussions about Russia and what it's doing and why it's a threat to the United States. It's an escalation because it is an act of the Russian, if true, it is an act and a policy of the Russian Ministry of Defense and political leadership to have American soldiers killed. Normally, the United States and Russia seek to deconflict in theaters, like in Syria. Even during the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States, when they were involved in conflicts in the same region, took great care to not kill one another's soldiers because of the potential escalatory implications. So that's why it's significant. Why Russia would want to have American soldiers killed in Afghanistan, I still think comes back to wanting to help drive us out, to complicate things. They don't want us there. They don't want NATO there. I know it's more than NATO, General Nicholson, but in the Russian frame, it's NATO. And then why do it this way? Because they want to exploit the deniability, the asymmetric operations. They want to have the benefit of the action without the costs. And they've been doing this for going on a decade, not at this level of seriousness, but this is part of a pattern that we have seen for quite some time.
Thank you. I was wondering, Mr. Morell, if you have something to add to that as well.
I was just going to add, to go back for just 1 second to Ms. Spanberger's and General Nicholson's conversation about, whether this is in Putin's strategic interest or not. What I think we have seen over a long period of time is Vladimir Putin make decisions that are not in the strategic interests of the Russian state. Over and over again, he has done things that has made it difficult for his country to have any relations with the West, integrate the Russian economy in any way with the European economies. And I think because of his actions, Russia is destined to continue to degrade as a state. So he is not thinking about the strategic interests of the Russian state. He is thinking about a very narrow set of interests about power in the world, being seen as a great power and being seen as a great leader. It's not about, in his mind, what's in the interest of Russia.
Thanks. And with the last minute of my time, I'd like to kind of end with General Nicholson. Your testimony that you gave ended with what I think is very true. You said, our long war in Afghanistan will only end at the peace table. So how do you think that these allegations, if they are true, would impact the prospect of U.S. peace with the Taliban?
Thank you, ma'am. Unfortunately, they have a negative impact because it indicates the Taliban are not acting in good faith. So the Russians offered, but if the Taliban accepted, if this is validated, then it would indicate that they're acting against the spirit, certainly, and perhaps even the letter of the agreement that they signed with the United States a few months ago. So I think getting that process on track and having the Taliban deliver on the conditions that they are to have delivered at this point, and that's severing ties with Al Qaeda, that's initiating the dialogue with the Afghan government and representatives of the Afghan people. It's a sustained reduction in violence, and that's not happened either. So I think this construct that we've come up with, it's not perfect, but it's the best one we have. It does give us an avenue forward. Like many peace processes, it's going to take, one step forward, two steps back, one step sideways. But I think we need to have stamina to see it through. But there is a condition built in that before we progress to the next level of reductions, they need to meet certain conditions. So I think if we stick to our agreement and hold the Taliban to it, it gives us our best opportunity to move forward.
Thank you, General, and thank you so much for my time. Apologies again for being tardy, and I yield back.
Thank you so much. Thanks to all the members and our witnesses. I think this was a very, very interesting and helpful discussion. There's obviously a lot that we do not know. There are some things that we do know but cannot discuss in a public forum such as this. But I've heard enough to reinforce my concerns about what seems to be just a breakdown in the national security decision-making process. I mean, we do know that the president was briefed, but he doesn't read his briefings. We know that the Secretary of Defense and the National Security Advisor knew about this, but they too did not choose to take the initiative to ask the intelligence community to get to the bottom of it. And while all this was going on, all of the messages that we were sending, certainly from the White House to President Putin, were positive about the relationship, whether the G7 or pulling out of Germany or intelligence sharing or all of the other things that we've heard about. That it doesn't strike me as the way any normal administration would react to information like this, even if there was not 100% certainty. And all of you, I think, from your different perspectives, have helped to reinforce that conclusion. So I'm grateful to all of you for your decades of service and for sharing your insights with us today, and to all of the members for their excellent questions. And with that, the hearing is adjourned, although I have no gavel, but